They'll take on.
I want to welcome everybody to the second meeting of our Council for Continuous Improvement and Innovation in Texas higher education, and we have a couple of new council members with us. We have fleshed our group out to a full 15, and we have a couple also who were not able to attend the first meeting. So I'd like to give each a chance to self-introduce. So first, I want to welcome Elaine Mendoza and Whit Ryder, our newest members. And Elaine is, as you know, we have 4 members of this council that have an active responsibility while with higher education boards or CEO position. Elaine is one of the newest but most active regents at Texas A&M University System, and Whit, as many of you know, is a past chair of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Would either of you guys like to say anything?
Fred, thank you so much for inviting me to participate on this. I really look forward to it. Do I have to turn it on? Yeah. See, ever since I left, it became all fancy up in here. Anyway, but thank you so much for inviting me to participate. Look forward to it very much.
Appreciate it.
I just echo those same comments. You know, I told Fred I think he called in the reserve box, and me and Elaine. So, but I'm really looking forward to it because I told Fred we did a lot of work when I was chair with FSG and beginning to look at metrics and what they look like and learning outcomes. And so it's for me, it's real exciting to come back in and still be involved in that work going forward. So thanks for allowing me to serve.
Appreciate it. Also on the council, but I think that we're unable to attend last time, are Ray Messer to my left and Phil Diebel, and Guy, this is your first meeting as well. So appreciate y'all being here. Would you guys like to introduce yourself? I'll start with you, Ray.
I'm Ray Messer with Walter P. Moore Engineering Company, structural and civil engineering firm out of Houston. I was on the original committee for cost efficiency, so I guess I didn't make too many people mad, and I got invited back to this body. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Phil?
And I'm Phil Diebel. I've been in higher education for many, many years, retired in 2007. I may have been a part of the problem we're trying to solve here. So hopefully we can come to some good solutions here. But I look forward to serving, and I'm honored to be here.
I'm Guy Bailey, president at Texas Tech, and honored to be part of this group and look forward to having some solutions I can implement. So.
Well, thank you all for being here. We've got a great agenda today. As most of you know, this council really has a two-part mission. One, to explore and to set the measurable goals for the next long-range strategic plan for higher education in Texas, and the other, to talk about how we can promote cultural change on our university campuses for embracing continuous improvement in the effort to improve productivity and efficiency with our campuses. And it's that latter second charge that our guest today is going to be speaking to, and that is John Sharp, the Chancellor of the Texas A&M University System. His bio should be in your packets, but I think most of us are well aware with his infamous, or rather his long and storied career in public service. And John, welcome. I see you've co-opted David and the commissioner to appear at your side. So we'll turn the podium over to you, or the microphone anyway. I thought we were going to hear stories about when you were a student body president at Texas A&M and those shenanigans.
You mentioned long storied career. It wasn't as long as I wanted it to be. And mostly because of what we're going to talk about today.
Be sure your mic's on, by the way. Is that red light lit up?
Yeah, it is now, he tells me. Let me just give a few things that we learned back at that time. When you changes doesn't happen automatically. I've never met anybody for change within any organization, private or public, until you show them, you kind of lead them to it. First thing we did, back then is we first of all got permission, and Bullock was very willing, and so he gave us permission to do these things. There had been lots of studies done, and there have been sunset studies done that produced the same stuff, a lot of the same stuff that we did. There have been all kinds of interim studies. The key to it, and so finding the people to do the work and finding out this needs to be changed in higher education or this needs to be changed in food stamps or whatever it was not terribly hard to do. There are lots of experts, and we were able to just kind of pick them from different agencies to do this, sort of borrow the people. The difference was that we let the public know about it. And before all of those studies pretty much were done, maybe there was a meeting somewhere, maybe one little bit of press or something, and it was put on a shelf, and everybody in all the agencies kind of went, we've seen these studies before, all you got to do is fade that one press conference, and that's kind of going to be the end of it. What we did, mostly with Bullock's help, Bullock's primary advice to me was act crazy and everybody will, and unpredictable, and everybody will pay attention to it. And he did that.
We need to write that down as a takeaway, act crazy.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, but what we did is we took it to the public. I mean, we did it in a very public way. The example we cite a lot of times in doing this to the other states that we've kind of coached how to do this was the little food stamp thing. I mean, everybody's known for years you could do that, a lot cheaper with a debit card than you could with all the other stuff. And we just very methodically made sure everybody knew that there was a guy in New York that was making $80 million a year printing food stamps, and he was the guy hiring the lobbyists to do it. But you got to have somebody maybe close to retirement that is willing to take that on and willing to say all those things. And so if you see a problem in community colleges or you see a problem in flagships or whatever, I mean, it's got to be something that's willing to go there, somebody's willing to go there and just say it. Because the last thing any of us want to read is something bad in the press. I mean, we don't want our donors and we don't want our regents, we don't want our students to read something that we're doing. An example, low-performing study that y'all did on low-performing classes that you just addressed. I mean, that's kind of been out there for a while, but the only people that knew about that were the folks in higher education. Joe Blow out there never knew that he was paying for teaching, a class that graduated 4 people in 3 years or something like that. When they started hearing about that, when you started getting some press, everybody else kind of went, ooh, we're going to have a tough time justifying that to the public. And then the public means the legislature. And so my advice is when you find things that you want to change, whether it's a culture in community colleges, a culture in universities, or whether it's you want to, make them look at privatizing food service or privatizing custodial or maintenance and things like that, which I happen to believe will save tens of millions of dollars, our institutions. You just got to do it very, very publicly and have somebody willing to be the person that takes the blame for it. In other words, yeah, we don't want to do this to you guys, but that crazy chancellor, that guy at the coordinating board, or whoever it is making us do it, or something like that. You got to have somebody just willing to, with a little asbestos underwear, that's sort of willing to take that. And then the second part of it that's really important is that you have to, that person or that group has to respond. In other words, when you do that, the other side is going to have a press conference and going to say, here's our story, and you just got to get right back in their face. And when you get the public on your side, then all of a sudden things start changing. in my opinion, the folks that were doing this 7 solutions stuff before I got here, I always say before I got here, they picked the wrong target. I mean, it went after the core of what universities are here for. They're here for teaching, and they're here for research. And, you know, had they done something like, okay, we're going to try to find efficiencies and save money in those things that we can then use on research and use on to hire more faculty and things like that, whether it's food service, landscape maintenance, Chancellor's office, whatever, you know, those kinds of efficiencies, then I think it had a heck of a time stopping that, because I think the public would have said, yeah, that you're exactly right. And so that's sort of the way Regent Mendoza and us are approaching it. We're trying to figure out, you know, do we really need X number of people in the Chancellor's office? Do we need this many assistant deans? Do we need, you know, how much do we spend on grounds maintenance? How much do we spend on food service? How much do we spend on electricity? Can we buy gas cheaper? Is our IT out of control? My opinion is all IT is out of control, but you know, and how you rein those things in, and when you do that, you get a whole bunch. You have a lot of resistance, but you get a whole lot of support, I think, from faculty members, researchers, and people like that, because they know where it's going for the core. So, you know, the first advice I would give you is, A, if you really want to change the culture, identify those things that you look at and you know the public would never stand for this if they knew. Whether it is a college that's not telling kids that courses that they're teaching, picking on anybody, but courses they're teaching in a community college will never count toward a degree. I mean, the public would never go, oh my God, this kid got out of this class in a community college with 100 hours and 20 of them count toward a degree or something like that. Not picking on anybody, it's just an example. You happen to be there, and so I use that as an example. But those kind of things, public doesn't know that. Those kids don't find out. Public finds out about that, they'd go crazy. And they would be 100% supportive and say, okay, let's fix this, or let's fix this at A&M, or these various things. And the folks to do that are all over the place. I mean, you've got them at the coordinating board. You bar them probably at the controller's office. I mean, all you need is a governor or lieutenant governor or somebody else that says, hey, let you bar these people temporarily to take a look at all this stuff. And then the second thing you have to do is make sure you're right, make sure you go through the debates, because one time that somebody catches you in a mistake kind of zaps the credibility of the whole deal. And then once you do that, then by God, just take it to the public and let the public see it, and the public, and then everything quiets down, because once the public buys in, legislators will buy into the process, and the critics get pretty darn quiet, and you're on your way. But change is just hard. I mean, it's hard in everything. We've been doing this for 20 years. Why in the world would we do this? Why would you privatize food service or things like that? Because you know, that's my job that might be jeopardized by doing this. And so one culture you have to change is that all of our jobs, the primary purpose of a university or a college is not to employ us. It's to educate kids. And so I think, have always thought, you know, that there's a lot of efficiencies to be found in any organization, whether it's public or private. And private organizations have the same problems that everybody else has. They're a little faster to address it because their money depends on it. Their money doesn't always depend on it in the public sector, because their money depends on making sure some legislator or group of legislators supports what you do. But if it becomes insupportable and the public starts having doubts about whether this thing is operating right, then everybody shifts your way, and all the stakeholders go, these guys are serious, let's get on the program. Just as happened, you know, in this last year with the low performing things, for example. Everybody kind of woke up and said, these guys are serious. And so Elaine and the regents and us kind of, well, all of a sudden we sent a directive out to everybody and said there better never be another letter from a coordinating board that has those kinds of classes that we don't know about first and have the ability to correct it. And so everybody understands that. But prior to that, I think everybody thought, well, maybe they're not really serious about it. Let's see how long it goes. But it has to do with the public perception of it, and it's hard because you're going to have to get in the face of a bunch of people you like and you work with every day and stuff like that. But find somebody that's real close to retirement and doesn't care, that's usually that can get press, or better yet, a legislator that'll carry that water for you. You can really make, I think, a lot of reforms and stuff. But the stuff that goes in it is easy to find. I bet these guys, folks that have been working here, McGregor and others have been working here a long time. I mean, just like us, they knew what needed to be done. It's just getting the political will behind it in order to make the changes. I mean, you go after the university, and all of a sudden, I remember when we first made our recommendations, because Bullock was keeping me up to date on everything that happened, and all the agencies had a meeting, and they decided, okay, Hans Mark, who I love to death, but Hans is going to be the guy that zaps this little fly down and let him go. And so he had a press conference, and I had one 30 minutes later, and they went, what the hell is this? We're not supposed to have repeat press conferences. This is not the way it goes. And we just kept going, and finally the public kind of got behind it. And so if you had, for instance, I had at the very beginning a lot of A&M former students who were saying, what the hell are you doing? You're messing with special items. You're messing with, all kinds of different things and stuff like that. And then we started explaining things to them, and they went, oh, okay, I understand what you're doing, but it has to be, you get the public behind you in a very public way, which means that you're right in what you're doing, or the public wouldn't be behind you, and you could do it. The problem with the deal that happened last summer is they never got the public behind them, and so it was kind of a non-starter from the beginning. But had they gone into things that the public believed in, and that is, yeah, we want research, we want the best faculty in the history of how do we find the money to do it, we're going to save it from these other things, then you would have had an unstoppable train, I think. It just kind of went wrong way. And then after that, you get into any inefficiencies in faculty and things like that, and you would have had the credibility to do that, I think. Just kind of went after the wrong target first, I think.
Yeah, good observations. And by the way, I want to encourage anyone on the council, to quiz John or ask specific questions that you may have as we go along. I was going to start by asking you to, I know when you came in as Chancellor, 120 days ago? I'm not sure why you're not done yet, but
seems longer.
You've kind of been on two tracks. Obviously there have been some changes that you began to make immediately, within your own office in particular. But in addition, you also have hired, and I forget the three letters of the firm's name, but you've hired a firm which may be part of your advice to be sure you're right, but you're bringing them in to do a more global review of the system. Kind of tell us how you differentiated those areas of action, immediate action, versus what you're asking.
Well, the first one was, think just my immediate team and vice chancellors and folks that I felt comfortable with. I just spent time talking to them, talking to other people that dealt with them and things like that. And those that I didn't feel comfortable, that they were comfortable with saving money on buildings and facilities and things like that, we made some changes and shifted things around. That was kind of, that was stuff that just fit well with me and after consultation with the regions. The second part is hiring a firm that we had faith in, that's done lots of stuff with us before, done things in higher education before, to look at system office. In other words, and a little bit outside of that, some of the IT stuff and things like that, because I think IT is one of the biggest threats, spending money-wise, because it's like a father that lets his kids buy any toy that they want and then expect those toys to be compatible. Sometimes gets pretty expensive. And so what they're doing is looking at my shop. In other words, the employees that work directly for me, plus IT and plus some other things that are obvious and ideas, energy saving, stuff like that, that we kind of borrow from other systems. Oklahoma State comes to mind and some others. And so that's kind of small. What I would like to do and have talked to some of the regents about is once that's done, then I want to do the same thing throughout the system, including the agencies and the universities that are in the system. And hopefully, kind of the way that works is that you really in this process you need somebody to blame, and so that'll be me. And so if there's somebody that if we figure out that we can save at a flagship, for instance, $3 or $4 million a year by letting a private company do it instead of us and have more variety for the kids, which certainly seems to be the case in universities in our system and others that we've looked at. But if that turns out to be the case, that's a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth that's going to occur there. It's easier for the presidents to say, the guy's crazy. We got to do it. He's talked the regents into it, or something like that. It just makes it where they can have a good working relationship and still pull all this together. And so we want to do the same thing, throughout the whole system, but looking at those things that are non-faculty, non-research, and trying to figure out how you get that money that you save into what the core function of the university is, and that has to do with the faculty and the research. And then after that, I would hope that we would look at, whether or not we have too many assistant deans, all of those kinds of things that may have something to do with it, but are still administrative related stuff. And and probably we use different companies, as we go through the process. I mean, there are a lot of really good companies in the world right now that look at higher education that have a lot of experience, not just in this country, but United Kingdom and a whole bunch of other places. But there's a lot of communication that has to occur with former students, whether it's in Texarkana or somewhere else, just like there would be at the University of Texas. For instance, University of Texas just did something on IT, Bill Powers did, that may be the best in the country. I mean, they have saved $15 million on IT. But I promise you, it was sleepless nights for Powers as he was going through that process, because everybody wants their own email system, everybody wants their own deal, every dean wants their own deal, and he had to bring a guy in from outside, I think it was Ohio State, that was maybe the best in the country at doing that. I would very much like to steal him from Powers, but Powers said, keep the hell off my campus. And but those kind of things are tough things to do, but you got a system, in my opinion, that's running as good or better as it was before, and it costs $15 million less. I mean, those are good things and good examples for the rest of us to follow.
That stealing ideas, I told a group of students from Advise Texas last week that what is considered plagiarism when you're a student is called best practices when you're out in the,
That's right.
in the working world. So.
That's right.
Bill?
Chancellor Sharp, first of all, you must be near retirement.
I'm sorry?
Are you near retirement? Because you're the one taking this on. Is that
retired? I thought I was retired.
Okay, so you were.
Yeah, this is work. The private sector is a piece of cake.
You mentioned, those things that you're looking at now, particularly on the administrative side. And you kind of alluded to the faculty and research side, but you indicate that you're kind of staying away from it. But if you look at your budgets, obviously that's where most of the dollars are. Even though it's significant on the administrative side, the biggest dollar impact you could have would be, if there is an impact to be had, is on the faculty and research side. Right. Are you going to be looking at that?
Yeah, but let me give you an example, something I learned when I was controller. The core function of the controller's office is the auditors. If you didn't have them, you don't have a controller's office. In the university side, it's faculty and research. If you didn't have them, you have no reason to have any buildings or anything else. My point is, you don't look at that first, because you know that's the folks that are. That's the reason that you're there. So I would never go in and say, okay, the first thing we're going to do in the controller's office is say, let's just cut the auditors by 25% and kind of see what happens and all this kind of stuff. What would happen is your revenues of the state would go down because you have to have them to do it. Same is true over there. After we got through with everything else, and after Billy Hamilton, who did this for me and smartest guy on this kind of stuff on planet Earth, I think, after we got through with all of the other things, then's when we looked at that. That's when we went back to the auditors. Because by that time, the auditors themselves had kind of bought into the system. They had seen that, hey, everything worked fine. There wasn't all of this. Everybody didn't die as a result of it. They knew that they were the reason that it was there, and they also knew who was good and who was bad, and they would come tell us. And the faculty knows who's bad. I mean, they're the first group of people I went to talk to. They know what's wrong and what's not wrong, and what they'll do, in my opinion, and I've seen this in a bunch of different agencies, is they buy into the program and they'll come tell you, yeah, we got too many assistant deans, or we got too many of this, or something, or all of these kinds of things, and folks don't return to the classroom, and this guy over here is not producing what he should have been producing, stuff like that. You're always going to have that in any organization. There's somebody that's not pulling their weight. If somebody has to tell you, then they'll tell you when the time comes. But if you lead a frontal assault on them first, man, everybody kind of gets in the tent and starts shooting out, and nobody trusts anybody else to talk to. So you've got to get the core function of what your organization is about, buy-in, and and then go from there. It's kind of like Exxon going in and say, okay, let's see if we can get rid of some of these drilling rigs, and all those guys are sitting there saying, well, what about all the guys that work in budgets and all this kind of stuff? Let's do that first. I mean, you don't think you make a mistake when you go after the reason that you're there to begin with. You want them bought into the program, because the folks that know what's wrong are in the organization, and you've got to get them to tell you, or to tell the people that you hired to look at it. But like McKinsey, they're a little bit expensive for this first round for us, but they have a guy that just did this for the United Kingdom, and there was a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth. But boy, at the end of it, there was lots of buy-in, and they saved a ton of money, and they had the support of. It looks to me like they had the support of a broad section of the university, alumni, taxpayers, and everybody by the time it was over with. It took them a couple of year process, but it was one of the best examples in the world, I think, of reform in higher education.
Thank you.
Members, other questions? Gerry?
Yeah, John. I think one of the things that's got to be the toughest job for a chancellor and regents is that you say grace over so much, such a large, 11 universities in your case, and I don't know how many state agencies, 6 or 7, and a health science center. And I think as we look forward to change, that one of the most important things is that they aren't all the same. They're very different. They're not one. We've heard that statement about the 7 solutions. One size does not fit all. So you can't put the same solution. There's probably some basic things that might fit all of them, but to really save, they've got to be addressed as different kinds of entities, I think. And have you had a chance yet to, and maybe that's somewhat Elaine's doing, I know, with her committee, but have you had a chance to think about how you manage those differences between a flagship and a very small teaching college? Let me say it.
Well, here's what I'm coming to the conclusion of. You want to encourage the differences rather than manage. Now, IT is a different thing. The things that the Lane's task forces are working on are different things, although there are certainly differences between the two of them. But what I think those 11 universities are, and you ought to encourage that, is sort of idea shops and incubators. Let me give you an example. In A&M Kingsville, there is a laboratory there that I have got to take Raymond over to see. That they have some of schools have a problem in that they take the top 10%, but when you give them a college entrance score with an average maybe 24 or something like that, they're kids that scored 9 or 10, and their high schools didn't give them the basic math or the basic algebra and things like that. And so those kids without something are not going to get on track to get through that system. There's a laboratory over there that's one of the, and I didn't believe it at first and started talking to the high schools where these kids came from, that can take kids in a semester, maybe a semester and a half, sort of with an intensive laboratory, and get them through college algebra from, what looks to me like about 7th or 8th grade math in a semester or a semester and a half. Smart kids, but were failed when they came out of high school. They just didn't get what they wanted. And, things like that ought to be replicated in every one of those institutions. For that matter, they ought to be in high school, as best I can tell, or maybe the summer before they go into college and things like that. But just a good hands-on, I think, one-of-a-kind deal in the country, best I can tell, that is doing amazing stuff for those kids. And I'm just now learning, because I'm just now going to spend a day or two at each one of the universities and stuff like that. But the research things I see and the ideas that people have, we sure don't want to kill that, because there are some really innovative professors, researchers, presidents that come up with stuff that everybody else doesn't see. And so one of the things that we try to do is make sure they all get together, that the folks that teach get together, somewhere, usually Austin, once or twice a year, and go over the things that they're doing. The folks that do IT get together, the folks that do everything from communications to presidents and communicate and do that. And so I think it's real important that they be given some freedom to do what they want, and they want a lot more freedom, I can assure you, on IT than I'm willing to give them. They were going to have lots of fun with that before it's over with, but it's just, that's kind of one of those things where everybody can't have the toy that they want. I mean, can't afford it. But there are other things that I think they're just great incubators, and I'm sure the other systems, particularly UTC, is the exact same thing. And what bubbles out of those universities other than the flagship that wind up that can be helpful here. And I see that all the time. I mean, every place I go, there is something that just knocks me out that's going on, whether it's research or whatever. And I like that, because I can go give speeches on research and these kind of things and don't have to mention SEC. I don't have to mention football. All those kind of things.
Well, we didn't have time on today's agenda, but we'll get to that. Ray?
You mentioned the laboratory at, I guess it was Kingsville. Mm-hmm. What kind of things are in place to take those lessons learned and put them in the other campuses or the other university systems in the state?
Well, I don't know about that one. I just ran across that this week. I didn't know about it. I think Regent Mendoza has been there, and they said, we want you to see what she saw. She seemed pretty pleased with it. And, so that one is so new, I think within the last year or so, they just sort of brought in collaborators from all over the country and just designed their own system in order to do it. But, I mean, you can rest assured that everybody's going to get schooled on that and different things we do. And the other thing is research. I mean, there are things that an idea that somebody may have on coastal research or all kinds of things that maybe a smaller university couldn't pull on their own, but if they hooked up with AgriLife or they hooked up with the flagship or something like that, you can share it. You can wind up pulling the deal off. Algae research comes to mind between the flagship and Kingsville or Corpus Christi or something like that on the King Ranch and things like that, where everyone gets to share in it. Everyone shares the research benefits and dollars that go along with it, and so and you kind of have to, as you know, you kind of have to. Everybody wants 100%, and so you have to sort of, have a research vice chancellor that is in a sharing mode and wants to make sure everybody participates in a Department of Defense grant or something like that. So, but there's what we try to do is make sure that our vice chancellors that are over a particular area make sure that everybody. We education, our teachers, our system produces, I think, about 44% of the teachers for the state of Texas, something like that, and we make sure we get them together on a regular basis because there's just tons of really good ideas that we think are a little bit unique to us. We like to think so, and that are really producing hands-on teachers that get really good reviews when they go out in the community.
Can I follow up on that same question, Mr. Messer's question? Because I recall when you were controller, one of the tools that you had was you sent people out to various agencies across the state, and you identified ideas, and somehow you processed them and identified what you thought were the best, perhaps in this case the Kingsville Mass Center. And there you winnowed these somehow, and then you produced a document outlining the best ideas. And in that case, at least from where I sat, it looked like you mainly made them happen through legislation. You see that there might be some similar process within a university system or that this council might use to do that. I know for our part, one of our biggest problems is there are lots of small things that seem to be working on individual campuses, but how do you scale them up? And I think this is the basis of your question.
Well, I think that would be a great idea if you had somebody to do that, because you're right. We did that for school districts, actually. That was a school district deal where we would, when we did an audit of a school district or we go around, we sent people all over the place. If we heard about something that was really unique and interesting, I remember Spring Independent School District back then was just a dynamite school district, maybe still is, and others. And they would have these unique things we do, and we would publish them in a book and send it to all the superintendents and principals. And they really liked that. Wasn't anybody forcing them to do it, but maybe it was something that, they're busy, they didn't have time to think about it or something. They'd sort of take what had been done somewhere else. And we saw, and these folks, when we published it, would tell us, oh my God, I got 50 calls this week on this, of people coming in to look at it and stuff like that. That really would be great, because unless Bill tells me something or Francisco tells me something, I don't know what dynamite things are going on in UT system, and same is true for me. There's no I mean, we can do that within our own system because we can get everybody together, but I think that would be a great thing to do if you don't already do it.
Part of what this council will be deliberating on is whether there would be an ongoing role for an advisory council like this, in part to encourage and maybe be the home for that kind of function. It doesn't necessarily need to happen through a council, but it's once we kind of identify the goals for the next long-range strategic plan for Texas higher education, the follow-up on that will be, could this council serve in that role of overseeing and publicizing, as you said, make the public aware of it, what I think you used to call performance reviews.
Yeah. Well, it's two different things. I mean, the best practices thing, which I think would be a hoot if you did that, because it would sort of be a laboratory to save all of us. I mean, I hear about these things when I go to campuses or somebody comes in and says, boy, you ought to see what's going on over there, but I'm not going to Tech, and I'm not going to, UT San Antonio or whatever, and I may hear about it at a conference or something like that, but if you could, have the staff put together things that you see are just knockout deals happening somewhere else, I think that would be, man, I'd take that book and hand it to those vice chancellors and say, come tell me why all these things won't work. I think that'd be a great thing to do. We have good collaboration within a system, but not so good, with other places. Plus, some of those other guys won't give me their best stuff, probably. I think that'd be great. Now, performance review is kind of that's a different thing. I mean, that's sort of...
I guess I, perhaps incorrectly, was thinking that the best practice discovery and reporting kind of fell out of the performance review process. And so
it fell out of the process right after the performance review. Bullock passed a bill allowing us to go into school districts, and so we would go into school districts where we were invited. Sometimes the board invited us and the superintendent didn't, and sometimes the superintendent, but we went in, and so the first one was Mike Moses at Texas Tech before he was a commissioner, and he said good things at the end of it, and that sort of, he was so trusted that sort of said, well, maybe they're not so bad, let's invite him in. And so an offshoot from that was a need, we thought, and I think TEA and school districts thought, was to put together what we saw that was happening in all of these school districts that were really unique things that other people would like to know about. It was a big success. Plus, it really helped, I think, or we were told, the morale of the school when, one of their deals was featured as something that was considered a best practice. They made a big deal of it, but it was really more helpful to the school districts that, were so busy, draining the swamp, they didn't have time to kill alligators. I mean, it's just, they just don't have time to go around except for the conferences that some of them might go to on a statewide level, but it was pretty helpful.
Ray, did you have a follow-up, and then we'll go to Charles?
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment that, in our business, for example, we see the NIH syndrome, the not invented here syndrome, a lot. And so even though those good ideas that come from campus X, campus Y may resist because it wasn't invented there. So it seems to me like we're going to have to take some steps also to break down that wall.
Well, what happens, the reason the little best practices thing works so well is because nobody in the community knows that book was sent to somebody, and so it becomes the idea of the person in this school district, and not even the board probably knew about it. So what we noticed was it was their idea, wasn't Spring or wasn't somebody else, and which helped the deal too. Performance reviews are a little bit different in that it's kind of, you see resistance, somebody doesn't want to change. I mean, look at the constituencies that y'all have to deal with. I mean, flagships, universities, community colleges all have a lot of political power, and the only way you get past that political power is you explain it to the public and get the public to go, we need to do this. And it also makes it, when you make good common sense out of things that everybody really ought to be doing anyway but don't, is you can't fight it when it makes sense. And so you can't stand up and say, okay, you know, why aren't you doing this? Well, because of such and such. Well, you know, I mean, it's just, I mean, we spent a lot of time with editorial boards and a lot of time with reporters and folks like that, making sure they understood exactly what we were doing and that we weren't a bunch of nuts, and really explaining everything, and pick 2 or 3 things that you're just dead right on and make them your showpiece, and everything else becomes credible in the process. I mean, it's just, but, you know, it's sort of like, to quote Bullock, shining light on a roach-filled room. They start scurrying pretty fast when the light comes on. I think that was a public comment by him.
Fred, Charles, did you have something?
Yeah, John, we're all delighted that you're there. The issue, you've already kind of touched on it. The problem is there are all kinds of things like you saw at Kingsville all over the state. Every system's got something similar to that, and there is not enough cross-pollination between the systems. The thing that I saw in my time of service was the resistance from systems to many times to work together, to many times share ideas. I mean, we're doing a lot of things 40 times, because there's 44-year public institutions, I believe. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, well, why are we doing that? I like to use the talk, you keep talking about IT, I like to talk about Dell computers. Most of our college campuses are using Dell terminals. I said, well, surely to goodness, Michael Dell would give us a better price if, rather than having, 40 salesmen out there, he'd have one. I mean, why are we not group purchasing books for textbooks and for libraries? Why are we not group purchasing natural gas? You and I talked about that a while ago. Working on those transportation rates, which very easily, I mean, it's all about volume. And you would be able to drive those utility costs down. There are things you can do in electrics the same way. I mean, why are we having 40 different laboratories? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. I think for a long time, the public cost of higher education was not that high, and the public thought it was a bargain in Texas, but I think they've changed their mind. I think they now think it's too high. Tuition's gone up too quickly, and so I think there's a new mood. It may be that now some of the things that different people have talked about over the last number of years, maybe now the legislature will listen, because I believe everybody's trying to figure out how can we deliver this product at a lesser cost, still give quality, and still make sure that ordinary kids get a chance to get a college degree. And we can only, the legislature cannot continue to fund the appetite of higher education. It's simply not possible. And I think the paradigm is changing, because you've got all these poor kids that are coming down the pike that are going to have tuition assistance. So I think the dollars that the legislature traditionally set aside for higher education, and a bunch of it went towards faculty and went towards buildings, I think that's going to change. More and more of that's going to have to go towards tuition assistance, whatever you want to call it. But do you think, I mean, you're beginning now to meet the chancellors and the systems, and you're in these conversations. I know the chancellors meet once a quarter. I don't know whether your quarter's come up yet, whether you've had one of those meetings yet or not. But I'm curious with the time, and I know you know most everybody in those offices. I mean, is there a new attitude that maybe we need to kind of get outside of our box and begin to start trying to work together and see if there's not a way that we can really do something about these costs?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I haven't had any of those meetings. My first one is going to be today. I'm going to be with all the other chancellors. Although we talk on the phone, or 2 or 3 of us talk on the phone all the time. But my guess is the reason that doesn't happen is because there's some guy on each one of these campuses in charge of purchasing books and in charge of that.
There is, absolutely.
It's always been done that way, kind of like my grandmother said, if you always do what you always done, you always get what you always got, kind of deal. But that, without looking into it a whole bunch, seems to me that's a perfect example. What if there were maybe this body were in charge of doing that, and you could purchase those kinds of things, gas, electricity,
Right.
all those kinds of things.
Well, there's two premier organizations that are doing utilities, and the UT's got a, they've got a cogeneration. You've got a cogeneration plant. There's several other colleges got cogeneration plants. They're swinging off of those cogeneration plants to negotiate with utilities. I mean, there's really some sophisticated people already in the systems. But the standalone schools, particularly, and some of the smaller general academics, don't have access to those contacts, those knowledge. I mean, it's a complicated issue. You just can't, come in off of the turnip farm and go in there and try to negotiate with these utilities. They're very smart folks. But we are not sharing best practices to the level that we should.
I think
you're learning some things on construction. I learned some things on construction. We are not sharing those. We tried in the 5 years that I was Chancellor. We tried many times in those quarterly meetings. You're going to have the first of today, I know. We tried to do those kinds of things. There just wasn't enough push. Maybe the legislature wasn't mad enough. Maybe the public wasn't mad enough. But I think we're probably pretty close to a tipping point that folks are saying, why are you guys not doing that? It makes no sense.
Well, let me give you an example. And I hear about those things, particularly in other states, by accident. I mean, right. Somebody will tell me, sure. Boy, did you see what's going on in Oklahoma State? As an example, Oklahoma right. State gets these folks in to kind of train folks on how to turn off the lights.
Right.
And a bunch of stuff like that, and it's just tens of millions of dollars that were saved at that institution over the course of the last year or 2 years because there was somebody that was able to kind of change the culture about how you use electricity and stuff like that.
We've now got these automatic light switches that go off if you're not in there for a little while. So
well, yeah, but then at 4 o'clock in the morning, the janitors come in and they're scared of the dark and they leave them on until the rest of the time. And it's kind of they tried that, but they couldn't get it done that way. But they kind of reversed the reward incentive. The point is that I heard about that by accident. I think you got something there. I mean, if this body in particular, not just Texas schools, but all over the place, if you could have some folks that could identify those things and maybe not flesh them out in their entirety, but just say, boy, you ought to look at this, and we get some kind of document that says do it. I guarantee you I'll send somebody over there to figure out what it is. And
there's a section in the cost efficiencies report that a couple of the folks up here participated in that made a start at that identified some best practices, and a couple of the ideas were, UT and A&M systems kind of have that economy of scale for purchasing power, but what about all the other institutions? What about the community colleges forming cooperative purchasing pools? So some of those ideas are in there, but if there's not an ongoing effort to keep bringing those up and how those evolve and change over time, then it's not as meaningful.
Yeah, we can use the purchasing power within our system and do use that within our system on some things, but going beyond that that the system is a small part of the whole deal.
Well, there are junior college systems that I'm aware of that are very large, that will have maybe, just so I don't tell who this is, we'll say 4 or 5 campuses, and each one of those campuses has its own purchasing department. That makes absolutely they're all in the same town. It makes no sense to me as to why you would do that.
Well, my guess is you look at those campuses, and on a single campus, there may be 5 or 10 human resource people, too.
Absolutely.
This dean wants one, and this guy wants one, and they don't
See, I think that you've said a lot of smart things. But
never mind that everybody applies online anyway.
I think the smartest thing you did, and of course you were able to do it as an elected official, and as you know, as an elected official, you do all the TV cameras where you might not if you were not elected official. But the smartest thing you said was getting the public on your side. You've got to go out there and tell that story. And for this body, you've got to figure out who that is. You don't want to put the commissioner in that spot, I don't think. But there needs to be somebody that goes out and tells that story. Every time I get whipped in the legislature, I'd always blame myself. I said, well, I haven't done a good job of getting back into those districts and explaining why this is a good idea. Because it always works. I mean, the process absolutely works. The legislatures truly do their best to reflect what the feelings are of their community. And if they're if they're against you, it's because you haven't done a good enough job of getting out there and telling the story. Now, you must have felt the same way as you went around the state making those speeches.
You got to get the public, because if you don't, what happens is that, you know, even at the level of regents and chancellor, the folks you see every day are the ones that are not going to be for this deal.
Right.
And so they're, you know, so the, you know, your natural instinct is, well, why am I putting up with this? You know, I've got a, this dean's mad at me, this person's mad at me, and all this kind of stuff. But if the public is in the deal, then all of a sudden all of that resistance goes away, and the attitude becomes, okay, how do we get this done?
Roberto?
I want to get back to the concept of doing like a clearinghouse for best practices and things of that nature. I think it's a great idea as well. I want to look at what the dimension that David brought up, and that's bringing things up to scale. I'm an elected official in San Antonio, and we don't have the resources we did 10 years ago. And so we're having to look at best practices and trying to get as much out of everything that we do in our implementation. However, our frustration is bringing things up to scale. We have grants all over the place and great things happening, like in math or in developmental ed or whatever. You know, the Commissioner's been great in supporting us in those areas. But after those grants are done, we go back to doing the same thing. And so my concern is, if we do a best practices clearinghouse or something like that, is that we have examples of things that are brought up to scale. Because from my viewpoint, it's great to do things in terms of efficiencies for saving electricity or utilities or buying or doing a purchasing co-op or whatever. That's easy to do because it's controlled from central office. But there's so many silos in our system. For example, we have 5 colleges and 3 centers. And some of these people are very resistant to another college doing something better than they do, and they don't share. And so last night, for example, we had a presentation of a math program at Northeast Lakeview. And it was wonderful. We had kids that turned around that had no interest in math, and they were first-time in college students. And this grant turned them around, and now they're exemplary math students, and they're all moving to Texas State as part of our agreement with them. But this program or this grant is going to be over in about a year and a half. What do we do then? And so the question from our board last night was, how do we bring this up to scale, and what will it cost? And we were talking about efficiencies in our systems. You really don't know what the cost is to do something unless you bring it up to scale. And so, again, as a caution, and a question to you would be, is how do you take a system like yours and bring these great innovative things up to scale so that the whole system buys in? And I know you said something about we've got to get the public involved and get some of the political people involved. But still, internally, it's really tough for people to bring things up to scale, at least from my experience on the board.
Well, I think if you wait for consensus, it'll never happen. And I think that's what happens a lot of times in organizations, and maybe even a little more in higher education and other organizations, is everybody wants to do some things for consensus. I don't think you ought to govern by consensus. I think you ought to govern shared. In other words, you ought to say, get everybody in a room and say, hey, look at this deal and stuff like that. Let everybody have a shot at changing your mind or the regent's mind or whatever. But at the end of it, you go, well, okay, we've heard all the ideas. We still think we're right. And then you just do it. I mean, but if you sit there and say, okay, I'm going to wait until I get everybody agreed that we're going to change the email system or the IT system on a campus, it ain't never going to happen, because they want their own. You know, they want this deal, and this deal will always be better than something else, they think. And so you just sometimes I think,
and I agree with that,
have to sell your regents on it and do it.
I agree with that, but again, the point is the issue of scale. You know, it's hard to bring things up to scale according to what I've experienced so far. I mean, our Chancellor has been real transformative in terms of changing our whole system around. But again, bringing in, and I'm not talking about, the tangible things are easier to bring up to scale than, for example, a math program. Or developmental is a big bane in terms of community colleges in the state. And to bring things up to scale, I mean, we're in the middle of a completion by design program, and we've been achieving the dream. But bringing everybody to think in the same way involves a very determined change of culture within all the institutions that you serve, or within your institution as a course of business. So, again, my caution would be that if we do have a clearinghouse of best practices, that those best practices are practices that have been brought up to scale, that people can implement, and then they're tried and true throughout a whole system rather than just in isolated issues, as Ray was saying. You know, in terms of you can't just have one particular best practice and then it just fades away. You've got to make sure that it's sustainable and continues for years.
Well, I'll say something I don't know if everybody in my business is going to agree with, but I think when John Connolly, just reading the history and legislative stuff years ago on the coordinating board, envisioned this being a lot stronger than it is. I mean, having the ability to say, do it. Mm-hmm. And maybe what we do is you know, just test the legislature and give them some examples of things that ought to be done, that you know, when somebody won't do it and everybody knows it's the right thing to do, there's got to be a hook and bull somewhere to do it, and you're it.
Just as a disclaimer, John was not, there's no planting on his agenda of remarks. All the ideas are his own. A couple of resources I want to mention that I'll ask staff to share with this council, because there are other examples of this effort, continuous improvement, happening in the public arena. One is, a couple of years ago we had a presentation, and some of you have heard me mention this before, a presentation by the state of Iowa. The state of Iowa, about 7-8 years ago, created not a department, but a position in the that reports to the governor, director of continuous improvement. And they engaged a firm. The reason I knew about it a while back was because they used the same firm that a consultant that I did in my business on lean continuous improvement. And I'll ask staff to send a link to that meeting presentation. I guess it was about a 45 minute discussion and presentation on what was happening in Iowa. They actually started in the Department of Water Resources or somewhere like that. It didn't start with higher education. And at the time they made the presentation, they were only just beginning to try to take those efforts to Iowa State and the University of Iowa. So I would encourage us to maybe communicate with colleagues at those institutions to see if they've embraced it. But part of the point is that this isn't just for higher education. This is an approach that could work in all levels of government, taking a lean approach to continuous improvement. But as I've been saying for a couple of years, why not start with Texas higher education, which is what I'm hoping will come out of these efforts. And along those lines, we're having a presentation at tomorrow's board meeting. For those of you who want to hang around and come to another meeting or access it on the internet, we're having Dr. Diane Lee from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, on our major policy discussion tomorrow morning, talk about what they've done on that campus to implement cultural change and do so successfully. So we'll get hopefully some new ideas out of that tomorrow. And if we could send the link for that as well to the council members, or at least those who have more time on their hands. Whit?
Yeah, Fred, you know, it's ironic. I sit here and listen to all this, and you know, for the 7 years I was on the coordinating board, we have a section every board meeting that talks about best practices, and we would hear something innovative that was being done around the state. And it was, you know, a great forum for ideas and energy, and you're having another presentation tomorrow. But, I mean, I really hope that what we can do is, what's missing is the power and authority. I'm not saying that should be vested in this group. I'm not saying it should be vested in the coordinating board. But from a deliverable standpoint, you know, we've been talking about best practices for the 7.5 years that I've been associated with this. And we've heard great ideas. I mean, we heard about, you know, AVID out in, you know, in UT and Permian Basin. I mean, what a great idea, you know. But I don't know if it's this group or so. The power and authority has to be where we can have a deliverable. And I'm preaching to the choir when I say that, but all great ideas, and we hear them every quarter at the coordinating board meeting. But the question is, how do we make, whether it's this group or somebody else, put a deliverable together? And you know, and a lot of that authority is going to rest in the state legislature and our leadership, our chancellors, and when they hear that great idea, how do we get everybody to understand the financial impact from a scalability standpoint? So I take that as a real challenge, either to this group or the coordinating board.
I think the legislature is real close to coming up with the idea of tying the funding to the way how efficient you run your organization. I think those conversations are beginning at a low level in the back room. Those conversations are occurring. So it's about to happen, and you could very easily tie that formula funding to you hitting these sorts of benchmarks that this group or somebody else puts together. But until you start tying it to the money, you're going to have an awful hard time getting it done, because chancellors will come and go, presidents will come and go. That's just the nature of the beast, and you have to start all over again unless it's tied to the funding formula. And you could put some of this stuff in there, and maybe the legislature the first time around says, let's do a pilot program. Let's see whether or not this little X works over here, and we'll do it 1 or 2 schools, and they'll report back next session, and we'll find out whether or not that's something we ought to say that everybody ought to do. But that's the only way you're probably ever going to get it done.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Disagree?
that's why the going for the administrative part of it works, is because there's a group of winners over there too, and they know who they are, and they're faculties, members, and researchers that know that that's where that money's going at the end of it.
See, well, you've been very smart, and not everybody has been, is that you've said from the beginning, any money that we save here is going back to make the university better.
Right.
See,
unless you think we're going to give appropriations back.
Yeah, right. So you've been in that game, and you understand how it works. So you right away have another place for that money to go to, because the members of the legislature, appropriations will be great to find that you've saved $10 million. They'll take it and put it on a project back in the hometown.
But I bet this would get our attention. You know, back to your question, Whit, if you give us the best practices and then ask for a response from each of the chancellors or each of the presidents or each of the community colleges or whatever, it said, okay, notice you didn't do it. Well, how come you didn't do it? You know, in a public way.
Yeah. And, you know, there are goals. It strikes me that that some of that, reinvesting in the university or the system is an appropriate way to use the savings from improvements, but so is giving it back in the sense of lower or at least slowing the increases in tuition. And this council at the end of the day could say that one of our goals, and I'm just throwing this out off the cuff, but one of our goals as a state would be to not allow tuition statewide to increase more than the rate of inflation, or not to increase to more than a percentage of first year or first 5-year earnings, or some such benchmark that would be meaningful over time. It's obviously tough to say the cost of an education should be X because over time that's going to change, but you can tie it to a goal of being no more or maybe even less than the rate of the CPI or whatever benchmark makes sense to this council.
Well, money drives it. You can rest assured of that. I mean, you talk about when a university is big and wants more money and doesn't want to grow, I mean, if you don't get freshmen to come in, you get transfer students, or you get juniors, seniors, and graduate students, because that's where the money is. You want a whole bunch more freshmen, all you got to do is tweak the formula and you get you a whole bunch more freshmen in a hurry. I mean, money drives everything.
Well, in addition to the couple of big takeaways about, making the public aware and getting them on your side, and then the sharing and promotion of best practices, a couple of the other things that you said that parallel with some comments I've made when I've had the opportunity with boards of regents, is that continuous improvement is about emphasizing creativity over capital, not in lieu of capital, but before the use of capital, creative solutions. And then that goes hand in hand with what you said about going to the people who really know where the problems are and can identify the problems and solutions. And that's the boots on the ground, whether it's faculty or administrators or the folks that operate the campuses. They know how to develop the solutions. And to me, that was the biggest mistake of the 7 breakthroughs. That effort tried to start with defining a solution rather than, I think you said, identify the problems and then let those folks who deal with them every day develop the solutions.
I guarantee you're exactly right. A whole bunch of the stuff that we used way back when came from a second level or whatever employee, Department of Human Services, that very quietly met at Schultz's Beer Garden with one of these folks and says, let me tell you what's going on here. The food stamp thing came from a guy that's 23 years old that worked in the Department of Human Services that just said, this is goofy, here's why it's happening and stuff like that. And now it's in all 50 states because of that kid. He's probably 50 now, but anyway, you're right. That's the folks to interview within the agencies because there's somebody there, maybe even the head girl or head guy that runs a particular division that's always wanted to change something, but just didn't want to meet that resistance of having to see the folks every day that they're trying to get changed, and so it makes it a lot easier for somebody else to come up with this stuff and them say, oh, well, we got to do it because Heldenfels is making us or whatever. But
that's a great example, the 23-year-old sparking the idea about food stamps. And I'll add one last thing. We need to move to our next agenda item. But in our own experience in my company, one of the things we did that helped inculcate this culture of continuous improvement. By the way, it is extremely difficult to sustain once you start it. Sustaining it is a big challenge. But we told our team members that if we improve a process and figure out how to do something with fewer man hours or fewer resources, no layoffs would occur because of that. We would find a different assignment, higher value work for whomever might have been no longer needed on a given crew. And of course that's different than somebody who's not performing or if you go through a down market in the cycle. But we pledged to our employees that the continuous improvement efforts would not result in layoffs. And what you find is that attrition over time, natural attrition pretty well takes care of those efficiencies in headcount. Any last questions? We've actually, I didn't think we'd get to 11:10 and now it's 11:15, so. Raymond, you got a comment?
Yeah, a very quick remark. In terms of best practices, Whit referred to this, and a couple of others did as well. We do have at every board meeting a discussion of a major policy discussion, then we have a recognition of excellence. And those recognitions of excellence can deal either with academic issues or cost efficiency issues, anything that makes that leads to improvement in higher education. For example, several years ago when Richland College, I think, was the first community college in the United States to win the Bainbridge Award. What is it? Baldrige, I'm sorry. The Baldrige Award, we featured them, and a lot of that work was built around cost efficiencies and reducing the cost of education. We know, for example, that if we accelerate time to degree and if we reduce the number of dropouts, that higher education would become much more cost efficient. And last year, we published a booklet of best practices in higher education that lead to improvements in both retention and graduation. We're going to get copies for members of the council. But those are things that we've done. We put them in the hands of academic officers at every one of the community college and university campuses in the state. What is lacking is, and several people have mentioned this, is the appropriate incentives, both in terms of carrots and sticks, to get institutions to adopt those practices. But it's not because they're not aware of the information. They do know about best practices, but it takes an awful lot of effort to turn something, make something completely different. Developmental education is a perfect example of that. We know that it needs to be completely overhauled in order to make it work, but there is plenty of information out there about best practices.
Well, I think that we've heard a lot about the need for a process and the need for incentives to take it from awareness and information to actual practice. Well, John, thank you very much for sharing your experience and your ideas. We appreciate it, and we'll look forward to the further happenings at the A&M system.
Let's give him a hand.
Our next panel on international competitiveness is our own Woody Hunt and also Ames McGinnis, who is a senior associate with the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems. Ames, if you'll come on up, and Woody, are you going to go present from down here? Okay. You can do whatever you like. You can stand up and walk around if you want.
Are you doing a break? I see some, or are we going to?
Well, yeah, we don't have any planned breaks, so folks are just taking them on their own. But if you want to
Start or wait till they get back. Yeah, most of the audience has disappeared.
well, I'll tell you what.
They're coming back.
Why don't we give it, flattering as that is, Ames, why don't we give that 5 minutes? If anybody needs to take a quick break, check a message, visit the restroom, and so we'll start in 5 minutes. If I think our 5 minutes have come to a close, if everybody could find their seat, and we'll get this party started.
I didn't realize you'd gone on A&M board. Congratulations.
I think we've got most everybody back. And here comes Phil. Okay.
Thank you, Fred.
Floor's yours, Woody.
Everyone should have a PowerPoint, and I'm not going to read that in verbatim today. I think you can take it with you. What I'm going to try to do is relate some conclusions I have after a long journey that started in 2000 on the UT Board of Regents, writing, supervising, and ultimately writing a new long-range plan for the UT system, and trying to understand the challenges that the state. So I'm going to try to deal with more conclusions and you can take the PowerPoint and look at it at your leisure. I think one point is a mind change, a mind that's evolved over time, and that is it's not about the institutions. It's about the state. It's about the workforce of the state. And my question to the group would be is who takes ownership of setting the goals for a competitive workforce? Who defines what that is? Who benchmarks that? The institutions that the coordinating board coordinates, are really a means to an end. They're not an end in themselves. So I'm one that would at least suggest that and it's a subtle way of informing yourself maybe in a policy sense, that if we focus on the workforce, we focus on the well-being of the state, the competitiveness of the state, the understanding that a competitive workforce is what generates the wealth, taxes that support our ability to support institutions, and if we lose that competitiveness, we have a serious quality of life challenge for the state. Up here, I picked one chart out of the PowerPoint, one that I think is pretty informative. If you look at Texas, we're essentially, and this is 25 to 34-year-olds, higher education, attainment, associate degree or greater, the most recent data. We're grouped essentially in the lower part of the chart, or with other lower performing states. And actually, we're only at the upper end of that lower performing group because we do a very good job of attracting people that have been educated in other states and other countries to move here. If we were looking at our own ability to produce new graduates, we'd really almost be at the bottom of that grouping of states. If you look at us at 32% versus, say, Massachusetts at 54 or New York at 50, what does that gap represent? Well, to me, it represents dollars. It represents dollars in complex jobs that 20% of our workforce can't do, that Massachusetts or New York can do. And so those dollars are essentially what translates into quality of life, translates into support for governmental institutions like higher education. So to me, that's a real challenge. As you can see, the U.S. is right at 42%. So, I mean, that's the reality of where we are. And the second piece of that, if you go back to this chart, which is an international comparison, it's not perhaps I mean, you got to ask yourself where you are and know where you are, which the previous chart showed us against both states and countries. To me, this is even more troubling because it shows the direction, where almost every country has their older decade the least educated, and they've successively, each new decade has become more and more educated. When you get to Texas, our most educated decade is the old guys and girls, and the least educated is our 25 to 34-year-olds. So not only in an absolute sense are we in the lowest performing group of states in the United States, but we're also heading in the wrong direction. So the gap's going to get bigger. It's not going to get not going to get smaller. So why? And it largely gets down to a question of let's see which direction that chart it is. Let's see. There we go. And it gets really to this chart. And our Anglo population in the state is equally educated with the United States. So that 10-point gap that we saw on the other chart is gone if you decompose it by ethnic groups. But we don't educate our minority population as well as other states. And that 26% gap would not be all that significant if we had a very small minority population. But Texas has the largest minority population of any state. 57% of our birth to 24 population are either Hispanic or black, who make up 63% of our K through 12 educational system. And once again, that wouldn't be particularly an issue if we had no outcome differences in terms of higher education attainment. But as you can see, we have a huge outcome difference. So the truth about the state of Texas today is we could actually outperform in every ethnic and racial group and still underperform in terms of national or international competition. So what does that tell us? I mean, if it tells you that your demographics, because we're overweighted, particularly in an Hispanic population versus the rest of the country, so even, once again, if we outperformed in every group, and actually Texas does outperform today in every ethnic group except Hispanics, and we underperform there, but not by a lot, by some. But once again, because we're overweighted in the Hispanic population, when you roll it up, we're less, as you saw in the other chart, and particularly in our younger population, we're less than competitive in terms of higher education attainment. What that tells me, what's the conclusion I try to draw from that is that our policies have to be better than anybody else's. In other words, if we have a bigger demographic challenge than any other state, the only way, we can't spend our way out of that. We have to have more competitive policies than anybody else, or we're going to have an outcome that it's going to be lower income in terms of sales and property taxes and higher expenditures for the safety net and for incarceration. So, I mean, that's really, and a lower per capita income. And that's the 20-year forecast for Texas. Degrees, higher education attainment, it's an 80% correlated to income. And so you can just monetize that into income. The outcome to me is relative, notwithstanding oil prices, that you've got an outcome there that is ordained if we do not have policies that are better than anybody else. I mean, it really gets down to driving productivity in those institutions as the means to an end of having a competitive workforce. The state is the largest contributor and regulator. It needs to set the goals related to the workforce. And in my view, the other conclusion, it needs to incentivize the outcome. I mean, we spent an hour listening to Chancellor Sharp and having a dialogue about inputs, about cost efficiencies. To me, the biggest driver of cost inefficiency is non-completion. In other words, if we push the completion rate up, we're going to lower our cost per degree. That's to me the most important metric, not full-time equivalent students who might never graduate, and we're focusing on their efficiency. So my argument would be we need to incentivize the pipeline, and that starts with the student to be better prepared coming out of K-12. We did that in the last legislative session as far as Texas grants. We need to incentivize higher education leadership that their focus is on completion. The coordinating board's closing the gaps, as we all know, had 4 goals in participation, completion, excellence, and research competitiveness. But my argument would be if we do not have a competitive workforce, how are we really going to support excellence or certainly research competitiveness? Where do you find other states, if you go back to that grouping, that was at the lower end that has research competitiveness and excellence in public education when they don't have a competitive workforce? To me, long term, those things don't work. I mean, if we have a competitive workforce, we'll draw the income, we'll be able to have the support for the other items that were the other goals of the coordinating board. So I guess another conclusion is it's time to prioritize completion over the other goals in a very clear way. So we benchmark. I mean, we're prepared to start looking at other states and other countries in terms of educational attainment in a very public way. We pay for the results. In other words, we incentivize, we deregulate, we decentralize, which is totally opposite of the discussion that we just had, or suggestions that somehow we're going to save money by more centralization and more regulation. My argument would be totally the opposite, that we need to decentralize, we need to deregulate, and we need to incentivize, we need to focus on outcomes and not inputs, and we need to focus on the state's workforce and not on the institutions. And I mean the institutions aren't important, but I think we have a tendency, and I've certainly been in that same camp, of spending all our time focused on institutions and institutional policies and how we save costs here or there, rather than looking at what the outcomes are going to be and where we are. And the objective measurement of where we are is that we're increasingly non-competitive in terms of workforce. So that financial capital that moves around the world and wants to locate and create a job, you want it to create a complex job that requires higher education attainment and commands high compensation because it has a higher education component to it. Today, we're importing, we have been, 80,000 jobs, and we're producing 160,000 jobs out of our educational. We're adding another 80,000, which has helped us move a little bit up, as I said earlier, in our rankings. But that can turn. I mean, those jobs, the 80,000 is all based on our competitiveness. If we begin to lose our competitiveness because we don't have the human capital that can fill those complex jobs, you get the out-migration. The story of El Paso, for example, is, once again, in 1950, educational level in terms of higher education attainment, 20% higher than the state. At 2000, 30% below the state. We export in every educational category except those that haven't graduated from high school. So take that to the state level, you begin to lose your competitiveness of your workforce, you get fewer jobs or lower paying jobs, more likely, than those that have higher education qualifications. You can turn that around and you become an exporter. So to me, the argument that the state needs to take responsibility as have the ownership of the higher education attainment of the workforce as a state goal, and that needs to be the end. We need to shape policies, or the state needs to shape policies that are going to drive a lot more productivity into our educational process. And that needs to be done in a way that benchmarks, incentivizes, prioritizes completion, and essentially only a competitive workforce is going to support the other goals of research competitiveness, excellence, and participation. And with that, Ames, I'll turn it over to you to tell us about how the world does it.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to follow Woody's guide, and I'm going to use part of a PowerPoint, but given that you're limited amount of time, I'll come back to say what the basic points are.
That'd be fine. Why don't you just, when you just point us to where in your overall presentation we can find the right slides.
Give us a page number. Yeah, I'm going to be, we're going to be, I just went backwards. I'm going to start at the beginning, and part of the reason I often don't give you the privilege of having that in front of you, because what you'll find is that people are looking down rather than communicating. And so I'm going to really have a conversation with you more than for part of this.
You handed it out. We're going to look at it. So.
Yeah.
But we'll converse as well.
First of all, I want to talk just about a perspective. I spend a fair amount of my time with states in the U.S., but in the last year in particular, but over the last 15 years, I've worked primarily with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris, and also with the World Bank, basically helping countries reposition themselves to be competitive, with a particular focus on their human resources. So that's from everywhere from, in the last 3 or 4 years, from India to Malaysia, but I spent a lot of time on the Russian Federation, and I'm advising Ireland on its national strategy. But this last year was an out-of-body experience of taking on the task of advising the government of Greece of how to restructure the whole education system overnight in order to be more competitive. And the one benefit of that experience is that from OECD, you've got to basically give advice to a country based on best practice in the world, and you're in an organization which can draw in an extraordinary fashion on sort of lessons about what works. And one of the basic themes I want to stress with you is that setting goals and metrics is one thing. Where it is really lacking in countries is the capacity to implement, to sustain attention to an agenda, and then to put in place a set of lines of work that actually will lead to sustained improvement in the kinds of measures that Woody just mentioned. A whole lot of countries have been good at enacting long-term goals, and then they get lost in a whole set of specific initiatives that basically create a sort of churn within the system, but they never wake up to the fact that all that churning with a whole lot of pilot projects and stuff like that actually has led up to zero progress on the basic measures of improving the competitiveness of the state. And I think that's the challenge of Texas, frankly. It's not only the long-term goals like measuring, like closing the gaps, but how you put in place the kinds of policies that will in fact lead to sustained change in the kind of outcomes that Woody is talking about. So in the other countries have made dramatic improvements in tertiary education participation, and I use that word because that's really, tertiary education is generally what is being used throughout the world for higher education. They certainly have been increasing education attainment, and I'll give you some examples of that. Far more, I would say, than people perceive in the U.S. I think they still imagine that the U.S. is leading in absolutely everything. And the one thing I will illustrate is that they're also doing so at a significantly more effective basis in terms of cost per student. The U.S. is out of sight in terms of how much it's investing and really not making much progress in relationship to comparison to other countries.
Do you have comparative cost figures per country?
I'll show you that. And a point that Woody just emphasized, the real key here is a focus on changes for the population. You can improve on individual institutions, and certainly that's a means to an end, but the real trick is how the individual actions really add up to a really improvement in the competitive position of a country and the population. It's really interesting, not only in this country but in other countries, how much the conversation is moving rapidly beyond just increasing number of degrees or completing something. People are really saying increasingly, okay,
You may be completing a credential, but what are the underlying skills within that workforce? And you will find, in fact, all the discussion of OECD shifting very dramatically about that, because countries that may have improved their degree production are not necessarily strong on skills, and ultimately it's the match of the skills in the labor market with the economy that is in fact going to make an improvement in the kinds of things we're talking about. So at that, there are limited measures on that, but probably the existing one relates to the measures of the competence of 15-year-olds, and OECD will soon come out with essentially assessment of the knowledge and skills of the essentially adult workforce, which I think will be extremely revealing in that some of the places that are way up on the chart that Woody just illustrated are low on the skill scale, and they're not making much progress in terms of their underlying economy. Now, what I'm going to show you now is, I think, a fascinating set of slides that were put together by Andreas Schleicher, who I think was just recently in Houston, in fact, making a presentation, which will really show you, Fred, basically what you just said. If you look at the basic point, many systems have done well in getting people through to higher education qualifications, but it's pretty dramatic if you look at down one side of the amount per student that countries are spending. That's on the axis going up and down, and then the percentage of the population getting through to a credential. And just look how this has changed over a period of time. You'll see the U.S. is that white picture, ahead in 1995. So others moving way ahead of where we are. What's happening in the U.S. is that we're improving very little, but the cost per student is going up like mad. In fact, it's going out. This is a wonderful picture. It shows that it's basically going out of sight.
Literally.
The other point I want to just make is that if you look at who we're competing with in the world, if you talk about the population, 55 to 64, about 39 million people. Population 25 to 34, about 81 million. If you just look at the change in the composition of that population, who has the population? There are other parts of the world that have a much larger portion of the share. And then that will, anyway, the charts basically show that the U.S. share of the educated workforce is changing and get much smaller than it used to be. This is another picture of the spending picture. My colleague Dennis translated this into percentage of GDP. What you'll see is the U.S. is spending much more of its GDP than other countries. But if you look at it in terms of actually people ever getting through to a credential, other countries are doing that considerably more effectively for the dollars expended. Now,
if you'll go back to that just for a second. So that is, those dots represent different countries and the spending of percentage of GDP on all education, all public?
No, this is post-secondary.
Just okay.
Yeah. And the source is Education at a Glance from OECD. So a country like Korea is way up there, but it's also spending more. But the countries further down the line are spending a lot less, but getting at least equal, if almost greater. Now, I have in this presentation a number of illustrations, and I don't want to dwell on them too much, but there are a couple of examples, and I'll just sort of say why they're in there. Minnesota was really an early leader in setting up a set of measures, and they had a lot of discussion in Minnesota about how to benchmark their performance against two things that are really different than closing the gaps. Rather than U.S. average, they had a long discussion about how to have really very best performance in the United States as their benchmark states. But they also began very early in the thing in saying, frankly, Minnesota is beyond many of the U.S. things. They absolutely must benchmark things internationally. They did that really before many of the discussions in the U.S. had, more recently about completion and degrees. And they really also focused on outcomes. Indiana is another example, and I wanted to save time, but I've just put those in the PowerPoints simply to illustrate the kind of, so that you can contrast both the goals and the metrics used with what the current version of closing the gaps may be. That's a listing of the measures. This is just one illustration of how Minnesota way back in, this is about 2008, 2007, was talking about the top new economy states, the national average, and the best in the United States in getting the percentage of people through. But they also were early in the game of saying that needs to be really in relationship to the best performing countries. Indiana, and I've used this illustration in a legislative presentation, I think, on accountability a while ago, is also a really good illustration of use of benchmarking with best performing states, but also, I would say, an outstanding sort of a presentation of a way to monitor things from an accountability point of view. You can clearly get an idea of how this state compares with other states and how it's making progress on a few really key indicators for improving performance. Now, the international examples, the intent of what I want to convey here is the extent to which countries are coming to grips with basically the narrative that Woody just outlined for you. The two examples I'm going to give are the United Kingdom and Australia. They're back in 2006 and then 2008. But both of these countries are basically saying that their current configuration of their skills is absolutely not competitive with the future of the world economy, that they must make dramatic change. But the really interesting thing about both these examples is they do not begin with institutions. Maybe just to come back one step about that, a typical pattern in other countries on higher education is that they would have done something that would sound very familiar to Texas. The first thing they would put on the table is how they bring the national ranking of their major research universities up to global scale by either the Shanghai rankings or Times Higher Ed Supplement. What they're suddenly realizing, you can build great research universities and it has only marginal impact on your local economy. In fact, unless you have deliberate national strategies to link those institutions to the regional economy, it doesn't happen. The one thing that does happen with major research universities is that it can be a major force in importing very talented people to a country. But on the other hand, it in fact will equip a country's students to be able to go elsewhere, and most of the products of the research will be used halfway around the world where in fact there's capital to link those ideas with actually doing something. So in both these countries, while there's a concern about the research university issue, if you look at how they really frame the issue, and just to give you an example with the UK, and you can read that in terms of the language, they're basically saying this was a country that was doing beautifully on natural resources and a labor force that was just wonderful. But the reality of the matter is that it's totally ineffective now. And their whole strategy is, in fact, to build the knowledge and skills of the population. Notice they did not just say increase the number of degrees. They're really talking about the broad range of competencies in the population at a whole range. The same thing with, and they've set goals. I just want to stress one language here: exceeding 40% of the population, world-class skills, And in the wording in the UK, they talk not about degree levels, they talk about competence levels in terms of their national qualifications framework. Australia, the same way, is falling behind other countries in performance and investment. And they've set a broad strategy where they're very similar to the discussion in the United States. On the second one, we are now 9th out of 30th in the proportion of the population, 25 to 34. And the reality is that they must turn around the whole situation. So they have really used, there are two examples of countries that have used the basic crisis and the adequacy of basic competence in the population as something that must be turned around, and it is that kind of basic narrative which is driving their reforms. I have talked with many people in Texas about why the challenges facing Texas, and it's pretty common to say, oh, well, you know, Texas has a major challenge because a lot of the population is, in fact, coming from countries with lower education attainment. And the kind of point I try to make is how important it is for Texas to be deeply engaged in reform in Latin America, that in fact I would guess even looking at the people at this, the kinds of businesses and operations that you do, many of you may be active in doing business in Latin America. But this is a region of the world which is undergoing dramatic growth, particularly in countries like Chile, Colombia, Brazil, and is in fact going to be a driving part of the world economy much more than people realize. So while the population may be relatively undereducated now, the changes are dramatic. If you go back to that chart that I gave you before and look at the countries in Latin America, how they have moved in terms of the number of people getting through to credential. There's a report called Measuring Up, which looks at the improvement of countries in Latin America on the assessment of the knowledge and skills of 15-year-olds. And the truth is that you can't see the picture on this chart as well as you can see. If you look at the Latin American countries, they are below the OECD average. But if you look at the changes and improvements, they are dramatic. And you will see in particular, unfortunately, these things don't show up in the way, but let me just take it, and I think you can see it more precisely on the slides. If you see the rate of improvement in reading, mathematics, and science throughout Latin America, you are coming very quickly to something which should be a little frightening to Texas. You're going to have a convergence of knowledge and skills of two populations, and an economy which, in fact, can employ those people at a price one fraction of what exists in Texas. So it will no longer be a question of going to Latin America for low skills and low wages. You'll be able to go to Latin America for high skills and much more competitive wages. So the need to get a much more skilled workforce to be competitive in Texas is overwhelmingly clear. And in fact, you're likely to have a reverse migration of anything else because, in fact, some of the exciting jobs will be in Latin America and not in Texas. Just as final lessons from all this, I think the international issue is that you must really benchmark performance on best performance across the world and across with states. Again, as Woody emphasized, the outcomes really need to be population-focused. It is not only about institutions. The sum of institutional performance disconnected with the future of a state's economy is likely to lead to disconnected results and really not very much progress. One of the things that you'll find in both the UK and Australia is a major emphasis on dealing with disparities. It isn't just statewide goals and benchmarks, but they are both really focused on narrowing disparities by income, race, and by region within those countries. All these countries are framing their debates in terms of demand-driven rather than supply-driven. They've shifted from strategic strategies of saying we want to build 20 new research universities to one of saying these are the knowledge and skills needed for a competitive economy, and that we're in fact driving the system by the future economy rather than simply by the development of more and more institutions. They're really shifting from producing degrees to discussions about skills and competence. And the two measures the one measure they're using now is one I've urged Texas to use, but currently doesn't right now, although the legislation was authorized, and that is a measure called PISA, which you can talk about the knowledge and skills of the population of the state in comparison to other states. And then increasingly the knowledge and skills of the adult workforce. What is happening also is a fundamental shift in quality assurance. Most of the quality assurance around the world was really mimicked on the U.S., which was basically accreditation around inputs. The shifting now is really towards matching whether, in fact, institutions are producing graduates who have the knowledge and skills around a set of qualifications set up at a national level in terms of a qualifications framework. I maybe come back and talk about that in a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, if you look across the world, and this relates to K-12 as much as higher education, there are certain characteristics of countries that are really making progress. One is a really sustained attention to a set of goals and a clear understanding of the metrics related to those. And that means over changes in political leadership and changes in ups and downs in the economy. The second thing is aligning finance policy with that. Having goals and metrics in the air disconnected from the incentive structure basically leads to nothing. People talk about the goals, but nothing much happens. And that has to relate both to students and institutions. In fact, I think you'll find increasingly an emphasis on incentives on students' side to really change the demand structure. The other point is, I really stressed and began this thing, is really the implementation capacity. The countries that are moving ahead are leading to strategic direction at a national level, but deliberate strategies to decentralize, increase flexibility, in fact enabling the entities within the country to be able to compete in an incredibly complicated marketplace. What they're doing then is balancing that with a whole redesign of what policy is about, and that has a lot to do with this kind of goals that they set, the metrics they use, and the incentive structure within the finance system. So that's basically a picture of what other countries are doing. I would say the U.S., compared to what you would see even in Ireland as it recovers from its economy, compared to where we are compared to those other countries, you sort of wonder how we are ever going to make progress with essentially disarray and clarity about goals. And in particular, our capacity to stay focused on an agenda and establish sort of the implementing capacity to actually make something change. So that's, I at least have made it by 12.
12:05. Let me make real quickly one addition to Ames, and he mentioned it a couple of times, and that's where the OECD is today. I mean, they were the forerunner and the creator of this international benchmarking, but since at least 2005, they have continued that, but they've moved from the supply side to the demand side in relation to higher education institutions. And their scholarly conclusions are the world competes by regions. It doesn't compete by countries or states or political divisions. It competes by natural regions. In some cases can run over political boundaries, even country boundaries. And so they've been since 2005. I think they're on their third round now of going around the world and helping regions and their higher education institutions work on the demand side. In other words, what role should higher education play not only in supplying the graduates, but also creating the conditions within their region to try to attract and retain those graduates within the region by helping create a world competitive economy. So that's really the work where the OECD is focused today. That's a dialogue that I think should be taking place. In other words, we're still working on the benchmarking that was done 10 years ago, but we should at least, I think, be asking ourselves, what else should these higher education what role can they play? And the state, our state, the Metroplex, the Houston area, the South Texas, the Central Texas, Far West Texas, they're all different regions with different international competitors. How do those regions organize themselves, and what role does higher education play in helping drive a success on the demand side, job creation, job retention, that matches up the supply side? So OECD's very strong argument is higher education plays a role. If it doesn't play, your region's going to be less competitive.
Mr. Chairman, there's just one point in my presentation I want to elaborate on a little bit, because it's directly related to the recommendations you've been considering about the future of closing the gaps. I mentioned the shift for not just more degrees, but skills and competence, that then leads to the question similar to your excellence argument. There's a fundamental difference in what countries are talking about in some respects, and even what I read in your discussion about the future of closing the gaps. Where countries are is really measures of the knowledge and skills in the population, and countries are getting not into the intricate issues of how you assess student learning within institutions. In other words, the national role is not to get into the question of whether every institution ought to assess X, Y, and Z, because that, in fact, is part of the quality assurance mechanism. What they're using, and will increasingly use, is two things. First of all, what are the knowledge and skills of basically the 15-year-old population, because that's available through PISA. What PISA does is measure the competencies in reading, math, and science, but it's done on a sample basis of a population. If you look at Mexico, Mexico gets results by state, so you can get results for all of Mexico, but you can tell what the differences are among states in Mexico, but also you can benchmark that state performance across other countries in Latin America or anywhere in the world. So one of the things that Texas, I know Representative Branch had been considering this. In fact, there's legislation of finding some way to benchmark the basic preparation of students in Texas to internationally. The other thing that's going to be available is something called PIAC, it's called Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies. And you will be able to look at the knowledge and skills in the population in Texas as it compares with other countries. Now, there is some discussion about using assessments of student learning, which in fact Texas has been a leader in, probably with Charles Miller's, encouragement. But that is fundamentally different. That information does not yield information about the population. In fact, the information is most useful at an institutional level to help institutions improve student learning. It's an entirely different measure. I just put that on the table because from my point of view, and I'll just be for the coordinating board to wade deeply into the latter, what institutions ought to be doing to assess learning will draw it very much away from what I think the key role ought to be is what the population as a whole is doing. It's an entirely different measure. So again, an institutional measure about student learning is one thing. What is really happening around the country is a focus on a benchmark related to the knowledge and skills of the population, and the assessments related to that are fundamentally different. I know that's a complicated thing, but it's a really critical thing in terms of what you might do in the future.
Well, some excellent and thought-provoking information and comments. It's about 10 after. Sure.
Press this. Sorry. I don't understand how it could be so different, the assessing skills in a population or assessing the skills that students in a particular institution. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I think that might be beneficial.
Let me do a quick answer, and then maybe we can come back and answer that. First of all, it's just a matter of methodology. The assessment in PIAC, as it's called, is really a sample from the population. It's not it's not at a particular institution.
Right.
You'll have in the results, information about which institutions they've attended, if any, but many of the people may not have gone anywhere. The other issue is that the assessments that you use, like CLA, the Collegiate Learning Assessment, is a sample of students within a given institution, and the information, therefore, is feedback for that institution to monitor the progress of its students. There is a great deal of correlation between the competencies which CLA is measuring and the kind of competencies in the workforce. That's where the overlap is. And just to give a pitch for Texas, the college and career readiness standards that were developed are very much in line with all that I've said. They're very consistent with a broader definition of the competencies that students ought to have. So it's sort of where the population is and what the use is, although there's some similarities in what they're measuring.
Can I ask one short question? I'm kind of simple-minded. I've got to go down. Woody always gets me every time he talks. I'm just amazed we get somebody like him around. I've broken my pick 2 or 3 times on trying to increase the retention of students. I've dealt with the population, and several of the people up here on the panel have too, that were people from homes where nobody went to school before. Maybe they were married, maybe they were older, they were working. What have you seen around the world? How do people motivate a college student? It's a voluntary exercise. How do they motivate him to the point where he will take science, math, take the harder path, come out with those skills? I mean, do other people have a different way of doing it? I mean, I know the ways we do it. We attempt to do it. But does anybody have a better way to do it than we do?
No. I think a simple. I thought I'd better give you a pretty direct, simple answer. But no, the list is pretty easy, and Raymond and David. First of all, a lot of students don't complete for a very simple reason: they can't afford it. They've got to work to be able to get through. Frankly, a lot of it has to do with the perception that what they're doing is ever connected to getting a job. And but it has a lot. And thirdly, frankly, institutions are often not friendly in helping students. More choice and complexity, lack of clarity about path of getting something done. And again, that's something Texas has talked about, because getting students on a very clear path, but giving them multiple choice and a deal of complexity and courses not available and everything like that is a major barrier. You can't just put it on students. But if you look at surveys, and I think I can't afford to go and I've got to work is probably number one. But whether this is going to lead to anything that is going to lead to a better job for me, and whether their family has ever seen the returns to education really makes a difference. But anyway, is that a fair?
This will continue after lunch, right?
This is going to continue after lunch, so let me just stop and ask who's hungry. We've got sandwiches over here in the Tejas room. We can continue some informal discussion as we get those, and we don't, we'll come back no later than 12:45. But if we finish early, then we'll get restarted as soon as we can. Ames, I sat at the wrong end of the table. I was going to ask you on your exhibits why you kept circling Finland. Was there something about Finland we need to know?
Well, there are features of Finland that I think are very difficult to replicate, and one of the it's a small country, relatively homogeneous.
Yeah.
It's also a country that has functioned in a really extremely difficult regional political context, being next to the former Soviet Union and a whole set of other things like that. But it certainly has been a leader in strategic thinking, and again with a very strong conscious strategies to build the knowledge and skills of the population. One of the features about Finland that is going to be very hard to replicate is a culture that really values teaching and teachers. and the status of teachers is considerably higher than it is in many countries. And incidentally, there is not a culture of use of assessment to improve teaching learning in Finland. So teachers are not subject to evaluation based on student assessments, and which is really an interesting feature. So, but I think they exhibit the other characteristics of they've been very clear about national strategy, and most of their governance changes in higher ed have really been aimed at how do these changes really position the country to develop the kind of knowledge and skills in their population. For example, one of the reforms they've done over the last 10 years is to improve their technical college system, which has had a major impact. But in fact, I think most of their new investments probably have devoted to strengthening those institutions. It's pretty hard to generalize from Finland. Instead of I worked on Estonia, and it's hard to generalize Estonia to Texas somehow.
I think if we told folks we were benchmarking off Estonia and Finland alone, it would be a difficult public sell. But
right.
For one thing, we'd have to let everybody know where Estonia is. But
that's a data point in itself.
It's west of El Paso. But Mr. Chairman, the motivation they have for the kids is if they don't graduate, they go to the Russian border in the military. So
that's one.
They're also the only country that paid back the United States its war debt.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's an interesting side note.
I think pick on places, and I'm going to go back to Estonia. One of the things that Estonia has been very good at is using public communications to convey very important issues and very simple messages to the public. The president of Estonia developed an initiative called Tiger Leap, which had a tiger leaping through a computer saying that high levels of competence in math and science was a major national priority. And that is the reason, if you look at performance on PISA, for example, that Estonia is leading the world. It's gone from very low performance to high because it had a very consistent strategy led by the president to say that was important. So I don't want to.
Well, what I want to try to do with the remaining hour and 10 minutes or so we've got is focus on beginning to identify what ought to be Texas' next set of benchmarks, at least in these areas we've discussed. And you brought up a couple of provocative thoughts. One having to do with what benchmark we identify, and the other how we measure. And it's interesting because there just recently, I think yesterday's paper, there was an article. No surprise, parents and educators in school districts are already complaining about the STAR exams, which are intended to be end-of-course exams measuring our career and college readiness standards. And so we can anticipate there'll be, some legislative pushback. You commented that in Finland that the teachers are not, their performance is not evaluated. Presumably schools are not evaluated on student assessments.
Yeah, but I really want to skip beyond Finland a little bit because
sure.
I think the general pattern. I want to be an expert on K-12 reform, but although I had to learn an awful lot quickly for Greece, I think assessment of student learning is a key element of effective schools worldwide. And systems of comprehensive evaluation of students, of teachers, of schools, of school culture, all those things are really in all the high-performing countries, with very few exceptions. So to pick out those 2 or 3 that don't use assessment of student learning would probably be misleading, on that front. I think the real challenge always comes back to preparing teachers to use and make, use of the assessment results, and also their competence in being able to actually teach. And the gap on those 2 things is overwhelming. And also for schools and teachers a culture where, in fact, they share assessment results and understand and monitor and improve student performance. So it has a lot to do with teachers, school leaders, teacher preparation. That it is let me just go back to the point. I think that Texas, and along with this whole set of other states, will have a major challenge getting improved performance in a culture which is highly decentralized and a culture of local control. And one of the things that higher ed can do is make very clear, as you tried to do in the college and career readiness standards, that in fact, if you're going to succeed in higher ed, these are the level of competence that you need. In fact, drive that conversation as much from higher education as it is, from the bottom up in schools.
Well, perhaps we could start by discussing the type of statewide benchmarks we should be aiming at, and then as we do, talk about the right way to assess and measure progress towards them. But Woody, one of the maybe one of the few things, maybe one of the only areas where I've heard you and President Obama on the same page is the goal to benchmark approximately 60% of the population, and perhaps it's that youngest cohort, or maybe it's the whole population, in post-secondary attainment. And again, that's kind of a focus on the number of degree holders. It's not production by institutions. It's statewide population. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
I think, Brad, some of that really gets back to the best scholarly work now being done on what are the jobs going to need. And it seems like a little over 6 out of 10 by the end of this decade are going to have to, will require some level of higher education attainment. Now, that might be a certificate of value, associate degree, and so that mixture could be a little different. But that seems to, and that's U.S. scholarly work, I think, basically done by Carnelli at Georgetown. Mm-hmm. And Texas, I think we are predicting, well, we won't be there. I mean, so the implication, getting back to my earlier comment, is we might have jobs, but they're not going to be the high-paying jobs, because the new ones, it'll be a constantly push down to the kind of jobs that we don't want, are the ones that Ames was talking about, where we're competing with Mexico on. So, who is closing the gap? There's only about 11-point gap right now in our 25 to 34-year-old between Mexico and Texas. So it's a little scary given the income differential between, which is about 20%. I mean, it's about a 5 to 1 per capita income ratio between the two countries.
So as we look, I guess the question is, as we look forward to the goals of beyond closing the gaps, and what we've tentatively said the year 2030, just because closing the gaps was a 15-year horizon with 5-year increments, so 2015 to 2030, can we thoughtfully set a benchmark like 60%? I mean, or 15 years from now, will countries like Canada and Korea be at 75%? I mean, obviously, workforce needs are dynamic and changing.
I think that, first of all, you can blame NCHEMS a little bit for, the connection with a certain president right now. But that was really the Lumina Foundation that sort of got, so that's idea of his coming up with it sort of was late in the game. I think a lot of others were really, really talking about that. So I think there's a pretty broad consensus. It varies from Tennessee saying we're going to get to the national average, because that's about as far as they can go. But Utah is at 60%. The state of Oregon has a plan of the percentages of their population that should have achieved at least secondary education, associate degree, and a baccalaureate degree that's up to the level of 60%. So I think a level of 60% is really important. I just want to just a comment about Korea. I think that anybody on a international level, and people within Korea, would agree that that is a prime example where the issues of quality that I just mentioned are really relevant. And let me just see whether I can describe the difference between the UK and the 60% level. What the United Kingdom has done is reach national consensus with employers on a qualifications framework that says that there are skill levels, which they define as skill level 2, 3, 4, and 5, and they talk about the portion of the population that needs this level of competence. And their goals are, in fact, expressed in the proportion of the population that must have high level of competence, and that is not only knowledge, but it's problem solving, a more complex set of skills. So if you look at I think they say that 40% of their population ought to have levels 4 and above. I think that's the way it's going to move. In other words, states are going to set 60%, but they're going to match that by saying, and that 60% has to represent a level of competence that is connected with a really competitive economy. One of the things the OECD study is going to show is that skills are not skills are not skills. You can have a country with a high number of credentials, but the skills in their population don't match that number. And it's the countries with a pretty good configuration of, if you have a scale of 1 to 10, it would be in the skills from 6 to 10. That's where the stock of their labor force is. Those are the countries that are really competing. So maybe to put it together, Fred, I think it would really make sense for you to set a 60% goal with the complexity that would have mentioned. It's not just bachelor's degrees. But secondly, move to a point of a conversation about what is the configuration of skills that are embedded in that population. And move to the point where you have 40% of the population with pretty high level of competence in not only subject matter, but also the kinds of things that employers need to be really competitive.
Well, that raises all kinds of questions about measuring, but let me ask another frame of reference on the numbers, because the devil's in the details. Texas, unlike most states, counts technical certificates among our post-secondary outcomes. In other words, it's not just associate and higher, like a lot of the numbers that Woody has presented, because those compare state to state, nation to nation, but also the 30-hour technical certificates that we
I think that
measure.
My colleague Dennis would be better, but I think that most states today are including within what counts towards the 60% at least 1-year certificates. So that makes a distinction between 1 year and less, at least a certificate of at least a year. And so, most of the states that are thinking of that are by no means trying to get 60% out of simply bachelor's and traditional associate degrees.
What about the international metrics that you've both presented? Do those countries that are already attaining 56, 58, 60, 62%, what are they counting?
Yeah, let me say there's some that are pretty firm, I can answer, and others that are really, for example, there's been a debate a long time whether, in fact, Canada's high level of performance of what they count within their high level of performance is comparable to the U.S., and the answer is probably not. In the case of Korea, it is comparable. They are really granting associate degrees and above that they would call associate degrees offered, granted by their community college system. So it varies across the, in a country like Ireland, I think it would be definitely comparable in terms of what the degree levels are. So let me say that the high-performing countries, you cannot let U.S. off the hook by simply saying they're counting the wrong things. They're including more stuff in it than we would. That's not the case.
Okay. For most countries, it's not the case. Yeah. So, in your studies, or what are you embedded within your numbers, are we beginning to get at the ability to define, out of that 60% of the population, in the backdrop of this is another, in my view, unnecessary controversy we get into when we talk about education, post-secondary education, that is with the CTE stakeholders, career and technical education. They, we talk past each other because they say, well, we're always emphasizing four-year universities and bachelor's degrees, and that's not true. But the language of college-going culture implies that to many. So that's a long way around to my question, which is, are we getting to the point where we have countries that are doing a good job of, as they measure the necessary skills and competencies for their workforce, of segregating what that means in terms of the number of bachelors, the number of associates, and the number of certificates?
I can only use Ireland was a leader in developing a national qualifications framework, and so that if you look at what they call the third level, their whole discussion is on levels of competence, not necessarily levels of degrees. And what I mean by a qualifications framework, it's really a national dialogue with employers about the range of knowledge and skills that are needed, and the proportion of those that are really needed for a competitive economy. And frankly, that's where a state like Texas really ought to move, to say that, if you look at your population, whatever degree level that the workforce, 25 to 34, that in fact you may have a lot of highly educated people, but if you take that as 100%, you probably have, I'm just taking figures off the thing, 20 to 30% that would be in the high-performing level, where really what you need is up to 60% of that population at a high-performing level. And it's really a relative balance. But I would, best practice in the United States right now is to set a goal like 60%, which is explicitly includes certificates that are valued in the labor market. And that isn't just anybody, so I know that some people will be saying, oh, well, you're just talking about bachelor's degrees. I would say in a fair number of states, you could say to people, just get over it. Other states are way beyond having that argument. Just understand we do value that in Texas, and it's really an important part of the workforce. And particularly there's good evidence that one-year certificates can be, at least 1 year, can be of great value. Gates and others have supported really good research that substantiate, and I'd emphasize at least 1 year certificate. But they have to be of value to the workforce, and there are other criteria. So I think that now the other piece of your
and one clarification, just because I want to be sure we're on the same page. When you talk about setting the benchmark of 60%, are you talking about the entire workforce or just the 25 to 34-year-olds?
Well, I better be careful about this, but I think that you ought to be working at a 25 to 34 or 25 to 44. But I noticed some of the comparisons we've used have actually done 25 to 64. But the real heart of the matter is, and this gets to the question, because I think that the theme of closing the gaps has got to be your continuing theme. I noticed in just reading the materials that were presented at the earlier meeting, what's really stood out to Dennis and me is that narrowing the gaps by race and ethnicity and region seem to be absent. I think you need to set a statewide goals, but really have an expectation of narrowing the gaps by the key variables that are the real drags in this thing. And I don't, obviously, as Woody pointed out, making sure that you narrow the gaps with, in terms of the ethnicity are really critical to Texas, but it's also a regional difference. Whatever major disparities there are in this state, you ought, reaching your goal without narrowing those differences would be a real. That again stands out in a country like Australia, which has a significant minority issue, politically and elsewhere. So.
Well, some have said, and I don't want to hog the questions, I want to open this up to all the members, but some have said as we go forward, and again, we're trying to look to the year 2030, that that's segregating, or rather disaggregating information by ethnicity is becoming more and more challenging, because today's 25-year-olds identify less and less with checking off a box.
Well, it's interesting. You know, international comparisons by OECD do not have racial or ethnicity. They'll talk about country of origin, you know, immigrants, not immigrants. But they don't have variables related to race and ethnicity. And, you know, if you're in, it's one of the benefits in working in Latin America is that you almost sort of laugh about some differences that we talk about. But I think there are some other characteristics that, you know, first-generation students, you know, income level that still will be critical, because those are highly correlated with these. But you know, for the life of me, if you don't attend to differences within, you know, that are important to success of students.
Try to help answer your question on is it 25 to 34-year-olds or 25 to 64. If you look at Texas and the 55 to 64, we're either number 3 or 4 in the world. In other words, if Texas was just by itself. We're highly competitive in terms of higher education attainment in our older population, and as we work younger, we get less and less competitive. So at least to me, that would argue a strategy that we really need to focus where the deficiency is, and that's in the 25 to 34, or as Ames said, maybe at most 25 to 44 in the younger population.
But those are 20, 30s, 42 to 49-year-olds.
Yeah.
Is part of why I'm asking the question, but I agree that focus is more important than a strategy that says we all should work 30 more years to bridge that gap.
Right, yeah, right. You know how to do that? Yeah.
Well, I may, but we don't want to have to depend on it.
Well, one other quick comment is, you know, the OECD is funded 40-some% by the U.S., and I don't know any reason why the coordinating board staff, particularly like Lee and David, the research policy part of the staff, shouldn't have a ongoing dialogue to take advantage, because I've seen them pushing really within the developed countries the educational reform agenda for the world, so to speak. So, I mean, why not have a formal ongoing dialogue? Our tax dollars are paying for that, for some portion of their effort, and we ought to get a return on it.
I think you'll find it pretty good. And I think Andreas Fleischer was in Houston.
I think it was San Antonio.
Or San Antonio, I should pick. But he was my boss on this project in Greece, and so I, you know, fairly close to him, and he'd be very enthusiastic. Apparently, because some of these measurement issues you don't have the answers right now. You know, particularly in the complexities of assessing the knowledge skills in the adult population is something that they've worked on very hard. The issues about how there's a lot of progress, I think, being made on assessment of student learning from an institutional point of view, although I think there's a lot of progress on that. But how you link that to things like degree profiles and other things like that, that's just an evolving activity. That's the reason why I highlighted Australia, because Australia is going into in a major debate about how to rethink that. So that's why OECD would be very good as a partner, because these things are, you know, how you measure and how you evaluate it and link it to accountability is an evolving issue.
Yeah, because without the quality control, obviously, the quality assurance of learning outcomes, it's meaningless.
It's like you're talking about
it.
I'm just sitting there thinking through one of the worst weapons I ever saw anybody get before a legislative committee was somebody used in a conversation. It may have been Raymond. I don't remember who it was. I remember who the senator was, talking about comparing Texas to other parts of the country. And the senator was not interested in that at all. And he shut the meeting down, berating the speaker about using that comparison. He said, I don't care what they're doing in New York City or wherever the state was. I was just sitting there trying to think through the legislature as I know it, and having a conversation about we were benchmarking ourselves against European countries.
Well, I've had
How does that
I've
work?
had this conversation with at least the chair of your House committee. I mean,
Well,
Dan Branch
Dan's-
sponsored legislation to have Texas, in fact, it explicitly says for Texas to take assessments that benchmark. You know, I'm never going to allege, sir, you have spent your life in Texas, and I feel like I have, but it's
I'm
only
sitting
been
here
a day.
counting the numbers of people who I know would agree with Dan on that, who I know very well.
But I think my experience in Texas is that there's more receptivity to comparing Texas as if it were a country with other countries than there is with comparing Texas with the U.S.
That's probably
We can leverage our natural pride, is what you're saying.
So I think
got down to the core of it, didn't you?
And recognizing that a fair number of you are doing business all over the world, you know, dealing with that is almost easier than comparing it with a foreign land like New York City.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's the 13th largest economy with 25 million people. I mean, we can find some lookalikes out there, South Korea being one of them. That's not about the same, not as big in geography, but in population.
Yeah.
And, or Canada, for that example. So.
Good point. Roberto, you had a question?
Well, you know, in benchmarking and the age level you were talking about from 25 to 44, would it be a misstatement if I said that the bulk of that work would have to be done in community colleges?
Yeah, I think that is the number one important capacity and probably your biggest Achilles heel in this state, because there are a number of really good community colleges and a number of other ones that are different.
I understand.
But I also, if you look at any evidence about this emphasis on skills, the difficulty is this is not a one-time activity. You just don't fill somebody up with them. The biggest problem is they go away. So you need a capacity in Texas to not only educate the current group, but to re-educate in a much more deliberate fashion. And that's why probably the 35 to 44 is particularly important, because you know, they're going to still be around, and their skill level also needs to be kept up to date.
I think the concern you had, or what other countries did in terms of identifying the skill sets that are necessary and focused them around the economic concerns in those countries is very important. At our colleges in San Antonio, for example, we have academies that are structured for like aeronautics, IT, and so forth. And those students have the highest completion rates of any of the students we have, and they by the time they get out of high school, they get a high school diploma, they get at least 30 hours in the community colleges, they have a certificate, and they have a job with industry. So tailoring it to those industries that are important to us in San Antonio has been very successful there. There's another concept which I think is very valid, and that is contextualized approaches to instruction. The commissioner, I think, knows about the IBEST model. We've implemented it on a pilot basis, but teaming up the academic side with the workforce side and making the instruction specific to a skill set has also created a very, very successful environment for those students. And I think we're succeeding above 88% with those students. So I think those kind of policy things need to be looked at and put in some kind of form from the state level so that people can say, you know, you might increase your success, you will increase your success level, but if you contextualize your approaches and it's based on skill sets that have been identified for the state, I think we'll have more benefit and I think an increased success rate.
Yeah, maybe two, excuse me, Woody.
No, go ahead.
Let me just saying agreeing with the thing, but let me just mention some pitfalls that I hear, and I'm not suggesting you mention. One is matching with regional job-specific skills. Students may succeed in those academies and do very well, but what you're really giving them is probably not the benefit. They will take an immediate job, but what they're really doing is then they're going to move on to something else later on. It's really been the contextual learning which has been helpful in motivating and connecting. And the success is not just now we got them fitted into that job. You've given them some broader competencies that will that they in fact may go back and be, you know, go to onto a 4-year degree or something else later on.
And I agree with that to some degree.
Yeah,
we've had that happen simply because the business partners have pushed them in that direction.
Right.
And they've become administrators in their businesses and so on. Others have moved to other industries and so on. But the point, though, is the success rate is what we're looking for.
Yeah,
and,
very definitely.
And they become productive citizens of the state. We've had a lot of these academy students move into, for example, the armed services. We have a second lieutenant in Denver that's very successful as a logistics officer, and he started out as basically a high school dropout. He was going to be one. And he's very successful. So again, but still, I think your point, though, is true. If we don't set up those regional parameters or state parameters or skill sets and target those with whatever we're trying to do educationally, we're not going to get the success rate that we're looking for. Especially, as Woody's report has pointed out, we're losing our competitiveness. And so we've got to be smart about this. And those examples to me says that is one direction to go. I don't know if we want to make that a state policy or regional policy, but I will tell you this, from our colleges in San Antonio, we're moving more and more to that, working with the Workforce Commission to find out what are the skill sets that are necessary to keep our economy growing, tailoring programs that will provide certificates and associate degrees for that. And that seems a more meaningful, purposeful way to approach this than just saying, hey, let's just have certificate programs in HVAC or associate's degrees in applied science.
Right. Yeah. That. I think. I'm just thinking what the limits of what I know about this, but I think it would really be good to have a conversation with people. You may already be in touch with this about how to talk about a qualifications framework for the state, how to talk about competencies and things like that, and it's linked to, I think, projects that Texas is already involved with the Lumina Foundation. Right. So I think that could be really it. It's something the answers are not clear, but you could be a leader in the country in shifting the conversation to that level. And
one quick data point to tie all these pieces together from Roberto's saying the community colleges are a big part of the answer to Ames is talking about also the Achilles heel. One study that we had done is you spend $100,000 of state, local appropriations, and tuition in community colleges in this state, you get 1.4 degrees. So $100,000 gets you 1.4 degrees. You go to our public 4-year comprehensive universities, not the flagships, you get 2.36 degrees for $100,000. So the issue is getting benchmarks that are focused on outputs and cost per degree for us to understand where our productivity challenges are. Because this would indicate the perception is low-cost community colleges educate at a lower cost, and clearly in tuition they do. But when you do that based on completions, you don't get the same answer. You get a high-cost model, not a low-cost model.
And in defense of that, I want to, as a trustee, I've got to be able to justify the expenditure at the local level. And, for example, we have a 7% graduation rate at Alamo, given the data that's out there right now. But we also have like a 23% transfer rate, and those guys leave us without a degree. But that's not counted in our system. Now, we have also found out that about 22% leave us in good standing. That means they came to us for something, they got it, and they left. Or economic reasons asked them to leave, and they left. So it brings us up to about 77% had a positive experience with us. And that's hard to deal with in terms of dealing with it. And again, Mr. Chairman, the reason I mentioned this at the last meeting is we really got to look at our metrics. What are we looking at? For example, again, last night we had our Student of the Month, heroic story. Mother came back to college, has 4 children, is in the nutrition program that's going to go to Texas State because they've got a new one that's called La Cena. She is going to get a degree, but because she started as a part-time student, she counts against our accountability system. And so we need to look at our metrics as we take hold of everything that we're talking about today. Is let's look at the way we measure things, because our graduation rates, I will tell you, and I think Brenda from San Jacinto will tell you, are much higher than what the data shows, simply because we have a very independent population. They go wherever they want to. They don't have any parameters, and so they leave us without degrees. but it doesn't mean that they don't move on to something bigger and better.
One of my problems with Texas is that when I hear you talk, I think virtually everything in the country which is state of the art, there are some examples of it in Texas. And what you have is really good discussions, for example, about a whole new way to measure using, for example, Washington State's momentum points. And I know that I think I've heard about that and discussed in Texas. The real issue is how you translate good ideas into something that's systemic, that's going to actually have a measurable impact, or are you just going to be a place which does a series of interesting little examples here and there, and you have no measurable improvement? I mean, that's your biggest problem. I mean, you're a specialist in doing bits and pieces, but not doing much that really.
Started 3 hours.
Right.
The very same conversation.
I have a question and a comment. We're talking about community colleges here, and if you refer, Roberto, to the feeder program into the four-year institutions. But isn't there another layer that's the real foundation, which is the K through 12?
Right.
That we're not talking about here at all. And, this building has a good foundation or it doesn't stand up.
Right.
K through 12 seems to me like where the real foundation of our education system is.
And I could get into that in a big way, but let me just say, I think that higher ed through the community college system, linked at the hip with, on a regional basis, with their K-12 system, where you really have, which I would think is very clear to your academy idea, where you really have clear pathways for students beginning earlier in their careers, really led by higher ed and the community colleges in the area, is another way of dealing with K-12 reform. You really don't think of a stop. Students are engaged right off the bat, talking about the broader range of knowledge and skills they have, plus using the kind of programs you're talking about to get the students who are not engaged really engaged, because they're doing things that are in context. So the community colleges and the K-12 systems should be linked at the hip with the goal of getting a larger share of the population within a catchment area up to a higher level of knowledge and skills. In fact, if I had a magic wand, I'd reward that kind of collaboration and measure their performance on whether they're getting the population through, not whether they're doing graduation rates.
We actually have, I think, we have some examples of that in Texas.
I mean, El Paso has been always an example of that. The problem is, El Paso has been talked about even by people other than Woody for a long time as a real model of that. The real problem is now where that's going to happen in the places in Texas where all the people, where a lot of other people are in the Metroplex area. It's
let me bring you some examples.
Statewide.
It's not just the Academy's program in San Antonio. That's really a small portion of what we do with the ISDs. And I think, Ray, that's a very good discussion to have. Our dual credit programs right now comprise about 9,000, above 9,000 of the enrollment that we have, and we're at 63,000. So those are students that are sophomores, juniors, and seniors in high school that are already taking college credit courses. We also have 3 early high schools in our system that freshmen come into high school, and they begin a pathway to getting a associate's and a high school diploma before they get out of their senior year. Some even beat that, have already exceeded that. Some are graduating as juniors in high school and moving into our systems, and then they are transferring with a high rate of success and completion. So you're right. I think that's a transformational thing that we're doing. But the point is trying to get us to be able to afford to expand on a broader perspective. It's difficult, especially in these lean times that we're facing. And I'm talking from a governance perspective.
If you did a map of Texas, and I haven't seen this, first of all, if you look at mapping of community colleges and their coverage of the Texas population, I think is still a spotty picture. And then you mapped those community colleges in terms of whether they in fact are doing the kinds of things you're describing, and match that to the needs of the population. I think what you'll still find is large parts of the Texas population which is in desperate need that does not have effective community college services. Now, I'm going way out on a limb here. One of my frustrations is that you have a number of community colleges here that are really world class, and they are doing outstanding activities, and they're the ones who will constantly be cited. The problem is it's not extending those kinds of services systematically statewide to make sure that you're getting at the populations that are not going anywhere. And you're never going to narrow any old gap if you just rely on the first adapters and the ones that are the outstanding one, without realizing that you've got giant gaps in the state where people aren't going anywhere and you have dysfunctional local performance.
And if you look at that condition, if I might, just one more time, if you look at that condition, look at the revenue stream for those community colleges. I mean, you've got Ranger Community College that has to have a supplemental appropriation every year because their tax base is not there. And they're having to extend into little towns like Brownwood and Comanche who don't have the revenue stream that's necessary to sustain them, but legally they're an entity, versus Alamo, who has all this property in Bexar County. And then look at Dallas and Houston. And that's why there's a lot of disparity throughout the state. Midland is doing a terrific job out there in their area, but again, they're limited in terms of what they can do because of their local revenue stream and a declining state appropriation. So before you make any qualitative decisions on that, you need to look at their revenue stream.
So that
the commissioner's got his hand up, and I'm sorry.
So this goes to the issue about implementation. You can set goals and metrics to your blue in the face, but the countries that are dealing with these things are mapping the issue as you described with data and leading a strategy that in fact will assure consistent narrowing of those gaps.
Okay.
And that's kind of the cup and lip kind of issue you face.
Brenda, you had a comment or question?
I do want to talk about what more of some of the activities are that community colleges are doing. Not only is it the dual credit, the early college,
right,
high schools, but community colleges, and I say that broadly, and I do know that there are gaps. I mean, we have 50
right,
community colleges, but you see the colleges also taking the lead and working with the ISDs and pulling faculty across key areas, history, math, reading, and putting together what are the gaps in what you're teaching versus what
right,
needs to be college ready. And I see that coming out of a lot of this college readiness standards that have been developed. And
yeah,
so
really
the work
good.
is on the ground about how you start pushing that through. But it is taking the resources, and it is, I mean, we have shared counselors out at high schools. We're taking the lead on all those efforts. And so when you start looking at your budget, and John Sharp talked about repurposing, you repurpose into those areas, but you can only do it so far. And so that's the challenge you start having, is you can take the lead on ISDs, and I believe that's a critical part for the community colleges, but you juggle your budget on how you're going to do it. And I think the standards that have been set by the state are helping us do that.
Right. Well, but you're really interesting. That's the pattern in other states is exactly what you described. The real problems are between and among them, but the funding is separate. And so there's no incentive for working and playing together on the faculty-teacher time and other time necessary to bridge that thing. I mean, that.
And we're bridging it by finding outside sources, and that really becomes.
But I like your idea of going to the legislature with an idea that where you, in fact, provide a funding formula for community college and school districts that deliberately incentive collaboration on a regional level to improve achievement. Is that basically what you're...
Yes, I think that could really help achieve this goal a little bit more.
Ray, you had something, and then the commissioner, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to jump a moment here. Earlier this morning, we talked about the higher education and the kids not completing. I forget what those numbers were, but not finishing in 4 years. And we talked before also 2 years ago or a year and a half ago in the cost efficiency, how the 4-year graduation rate was so important to the cost efficiency of institution. One of the things I think that, back to continuous improvement, I think we should focus on a little bit is the advisors these young people get at the university level. My experience was, and I know it's ancient years ago, but they were awful. And talking to my 2 children who went through A&M, both bachelor's and master's degrees each, same thing. They were awful. And I think we're missing an opportunity to help these kids get through in 4 years. I just rotated off of a small college board of trustees, And their focus was 4 years, and those professors, granted it's a small college, they can get them by the ears and make them do it,
right.
But they got them out in 4 years. So
with that, yeah, I think, let me describe that, and again, this is talking about the role of the coordinating board. I think the most important things you can do is really make sure you set the goals in terms of getting more people through, again, to the diversity of those credentials. Secondly, to provide very clear, simple signals in finance policy that institutions are going to be rewarded for completion, as Woody just emphasized, and recognize that the incentives for an institution are overwhelmingly now to, in fact, keep the students they have and get them through an efficient way, and not just to enroll them. One of the things that's happening in the small private colleges is a good example. Institutions are increasingly tuition dependent, and it really matters. So I don't think, I think if you get the incentive structure correct, I think every bit of incentive is going to be exactly like the private college. I mean, they will invest in time because the student enrolled is much better than a student you're imagining you might get. Right. And getting them in and through, but I wouldn't get into, the one thing that you can't do probably at the coordinating level is get into, let's get them more counselors. But if you get the incentive structures right, they'll respond pretty effectively. I mean, Woody, isn't that your...
I would think, that would be the plan, that incentives wherever they are in the pipeline would help deal with our pipeline issue, which is about 13 to 15% of those, or 13 to 15 of 100 seventh graders that will actually graduate within 150% of normal time, and with tremendous ethnic and racial differences that have to be closed if we're going to have a competitive outcome. So.
Commissioner, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to a couple of issues that came up. First of all, if you go back to the cost efficiency study, one of the points that it makes is that working more closely with the K-12 sector is one of the perhaps the most cost-efficient initiative that higher education could undertake. Secondly, I wanted to respond to Roberto's comment about graduation rates. We do count transfers in our graduation rates for community colleges. And for community colleges transfer students, they are counted as a success. So whatever the graduation rate is for your institution, if it's data from the coordinating board, we count the transfers. Thirdly, you have an article that I had distributed among you, and I think this article gets to the heart of the matter. This is a kind of an executive summary of an article that the McKinsey company did a couple of years ago called Winning by Degrees. And the key point that the study and this article make is that there's a built-in cost inefficiency in higher education of somewhere between 50 and 30%. If you look on page 2 of this article that I submitted to you, if you look at that first complete paragraph that begins with the phrase "but McKinsey research," look at this. Read that paragraph very quickly. The key point is that the goal of producing 1 million extra graduates a year in this country can be done with current resources by making higher education more efficient. That sentence, that 1 million more graduates a year by 2020, which is very consistent with the point that Woody made, at today's spending levels, begins to look eminently feasible. This report defines 5 areas where universities and community colleges around the country have already achieved very substantial efficiencies. It identifies these areas: promoting graduation, producing or reducing non-productive credits and programs, redesigning methods for delivering instruction, running core services more efficiently, and either reducing or offering non-core services efficiently. I would suggest that might be a starting point for the this committee, this commission, actually council, to actually begin looking at specific recommendations. This isn't a perfect study. I commend the larger study to you. Once again, it's called Winning by Degrees. You can download it from the McKinsey Company website. But I thought it was a compelling study. It identified about 8 institutions, including looking at a couple of community colleges, that increase their productivity with either the same or fewer financial resources. I'm part of a strategic planning committee for the University of North Texas at Dallas, and we had a presentation by a Bain & Company team that is doing this work for UNT Dallas pro bono. And they are absolutely certain that the University of North Texas at Dallas, by undertaking some of the efficiencies that were identified by McKinsey, that they could produce baccalaureate degrees for $6,000 or less. And they're talking about offering a few core baccalaureate programs in high-need fields in Dallas, connecting the degree programs very closely to work skills, and that every course, every program would make sure that the students had strong workforce skills. They're talking about encouraging students to move as quickly as possible by going to a trimester system and encourage students to take courses year-round. They're going to competency-based instruction, which means that if students can complete a course in 5 weeks, they'll get credit for it and move on to the next series of courses. It's something that's really exciting. It's something that I believe very strongly we need to do. But I think these recommendations give us a launching point to start looking at specific recommendations that we can offer the state that would improve productivity and also help address the question of we can't do anything unless you give us more money.
Raymond, just to pick up on when you say there's one, knowing at least a fair number of these, there's a couple of common themes among all of these. They tend to place a high emphasis on competence, definition of competence, and also assessment of prior learning.
Right.
So that you can take this from a whole lot of different ways, but and it also they all relate to a degree of coherence in the delivery of a program, so that when you go in, it's not just a smorgasbord. There's a clear pathway, and it fits in a little bit with what you're saying. And it seems to me that what the coordinating board could, I always try to sort out what the coordinating board, I think that the more you do on moving towards the degree profile approach, where you're talking about the combination of competence, both specialized and gen ed, that are necessary to get a credential in X, Y, and Z, and then provide incentives for multiple ways for students to be able to get to those. That would be a way to do it, because it would go beyond the college and career readiness standards, but say in these 10 high priority fields in Texas, these are the ways they can do it, but they could deliver it in a whole variety of different ways. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Well, I think all the members of the council now realize what an easy job we have in front of us, synthesizing all this. So if I were to put Woody and Ames, both of you, on the spot and say, in 25 words or less, what 3 to 5 benchmarks would you recommend for Texas looking toward the year 2030, realizing also that the assessment, the measurement of learning outcomes it goes hand in hand with that, with just setting targets. What are the top recommendations that come to mind?
Do you want to start, or do you want to?
Well, I would certainly look to the OECD and because that's, to me, the kind of the leading research capacity on this issue and adopt their 60%. Now, I think Ames has said we can go a lot more detailed, and I'll defer to him on how he would detail that. But I think it's important for us to have a target, just like any company or individual, a goal, and we need to be transparent in how we benchmark it, and we probably need to, take out the Finlands of the world. Haven't talked about Germany, which is a whole other case, but find some lookalikes out there that we think that we compete with on business, and those ought to be, whether they're a state or a country, ought to be those our peer group. Just like we took the 10 largest states for closing the gap, we need to develop our benchmark of our peers that we compete with in business, and say that's where capital is going to go if it doesn't come here. So we need to be competitive on the workforce and use the best data from Georgetown and Carnevale on the relationship between education and higher education attainment. I mean, in the workforce and jobs and higher education attainment.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I think it really makes sense for you to set a goal like the 60% and benchmark to countries and states, going back to your point, that will have meaning and currency in Texas. And there's some that you might not want to pick, but I really urge.
Who would you recommend today? I mean, you each have mentioned both countries and states. The ones, for instance, Ames, on your slides.
Yeah, a country like Australia. I think the key is really a diversified economy, complicated population, size that is not, off the wall in terms of what you're doing, and there's some ones like Korea. Singapore is cited all the time, but I think that's an off-the-wall kind of example. But I think that Europe as a whole is a really good example of a country, of a region which has been using this approach in the Lisbon goals and targets. But I think a country in European context. So anyway, we can give you some advice about that. The second thing I would add is I think that you need some way to look at the knowledge and skills of the population of Texas from a comparative point of view. And doing something like PISA at a state level, which is the knowledge and skills of 15-year-olds, which has already been mandated, or there's an authorizing statute doing that, either that or TIMS or some assessment, so that you can say, okay, what are the knowledge and skills? There are efforts to link the performance of Texas on the National Assessment of Education Progress and relate those to PISA results. But I think you ought to do the assessment in here. The second thing is, just to back up what Woody said, I think you ought to engage in international discussion about how you assess the knowledge and skills of your adult population. Without that, I think you're just fooling yourself. You're trying to measure it by things that don't, in degrees and other stuff like that, which is the best we can do now, but I think you could be one of the states. The U.S. is one of the countries participating in this program for international assessment of adult competencies. The sample size is probably not large enough to disaggregate by Texas, but you could pay to have the sample size increase the next time it's done. So you have a way of saying, how are you doing? How is your workforce really doing from an international point of view? The last thing, I would really discourage you from getting the coordinating board deeply involved in assessment of student learning at an institutional level. I think I've spent my life on that issue. I mean, literally. NCHEMS was the first organization in the country that proposed in 1984 that assessment of student learning was a priority, and we lived through the process of that. My colleague Peter Ewell is the top person on that. That is extremely important to be done at an institutional level in Texas. I think where Texas could lead on that, though, is really on what I mentioned, the qualifications framework, on the degree profiles. You could totally rethink what you do on program review and approval, whereas increasingly is based on different metrics. So I think for you, I just read into what is the FS? I can't remember the FS. Yeah, if you try to get into metrics related to excellence, I think you're going to be wading into a swamp that will you'll never emerge from. So.
Well, one swamp at a time.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of like lean, whatever this, what do you call it, the lean?
Lean continuous improvement?
Yeah, right. At least it's lean, it's not fat, so. No, I agree with you. No, I'm just fooling you, Fred. But I think but I think you definitely need to be concerned about the competence of the workforce, and that's a different issue.
So, and some of our members are specifically most interested in that. I keep coming back to the phrase "learning outcomes." I mean, competence of the workforce is what employers are looking for in terms of learning outcomes.
That's what I'm. That's
so
what
I'm the two last recommendations you made about assessing statewide assessment of 15-year-olds in Texas is not anything if it's not mired in controversy over how we assess students.
No, I think that would be good. Let me give you an example.
Secondly, adults. So how do we do that? How are countries doing that?
Yeah, in the early 90s, it was very common for states to develop a state mandate that every institution in the state administer an assessment of student learning and to measure, and that they were, in fact, so it was really state mandated assessment. And there are probably good reasons to think about that in a whole different way today than it was done before, and certainly Charles Miller and others would be thinking that was a good idea. All I'm saying is I think you need to keep your eye on the target here, which is getting more people through for the population and maybe not become as deeply involved in what I think is really should be the responsibility of the systems and the institutions, which is really how you assess student learning within the institutions.
But in the OECD countries and Latin America, who you mentioned too, do those countries, and this is two different points in the lifespan, do those countries mandate the PISA assessment for 15-year-olds?
Every OECD country and many others now participate in PISA, and it's not a mandate. It's done on a sample basis of the population of 15-year-olds.
So they sample 15-year-olds on a how are they selected?
They select I think technically what they do is they pick a sample of students in high schools, secondary education, public and private, across those. And in fact, the U.S. participates in PISA. So students from Texas are in the national sample for PISA right now.
Is this a statistically significant random sample of students?
Right, for the country. So what Texas would do is increase the sample size for Texas so that you can compare Texas with the U.S. and with other countries. That's
okay.
I think that's Raymond.
It's a little clearer to me.
There are other ways of doing this, so you don't just overburden students with assessments. There are ways of linking it with, for example, when students take the national assessment, which is also a sample, they can embed PISA within that same assessment. The student never knows the difference. They simply yield the results for multiple assessments. That's just and these are increasingly computerized and done in a different way. So.
Well, doing things that the student's not aware of, I don't know, that sounds politically tricky to me, but I hear what you're saying about embedding it in.
If you look at Mexico, you'll be able to get not only the results of how Mexico compares with the U.S., but you'll be able to tell what every student's 15-year-olds in every state of Texas know and can do as 15-year-olds compared to people halfway across the world. And I know it would be difficult for Texas to do something that Mexico is doing, but I think that it could.
And then the question about assessing the knowledge and skills, the competency, if you will, of adult population. What are the means and methods there that?
I don't want to tell you about something I don't know, but I know they've devised a way to getting samples of adult students. But because they're not only students enrolled in colleges, they're students who are out of college, who have never enrolled in college. And but I think if I go back to Woody's suggestion, being in a conversation with OECD and getting Andreas, for example, to come and talk with this group would be a real benefit, which I think he would certainly be willing to do. He could give you, chapter and verse.
Okay.
I think that would be, that could be useful in that he's head of the whole statistics section of OECD that does all the comparative data. He could give you a good idea about what other countries are doing and what's feasible.
Does anyone else have any last questions? Phil?
I'm still trying to tie what your comments are, Ames, back to what we are doing in higher education in Texas. I understand you assess the adult population, you assess the 15-year-olds.
Right.
Okay, well, the adult population may or may not be a product of the higher education system in the state of Texas. So we somehow have got to link that, and I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
No, I totally agree. I mentioned this to my colleague Peter Ewell, and he said, well, what does that have to do with higher ed? And I think that's I think the ultimate, going back, I guess, to Woody's point, I think what you need to be focused on as the coordinating board is the population, not necessarily the institutions. But you need to give the institutions to be engaged in efforts to try to improve on that way. They'll do many other things, but that ought to be the key thing that you really focus on, that you've got these institutions here of at least some of their contribution ought to be making measurable progress along that way. I'm probably not saying that. Okay, let me describe it this way, and I'm going to do a stereotype. What I'm finding in more states than not, but particularly Washington State and Oregon State, is that given the financial pressures facing the University of Washington and the University of Oregon, one of their top revenue generating sources is getting students from out of state, hopefully from the neighboring state, but increasingly from around the world. Because there are decreasing incentives for those institutions to admit students from either Oregon or Washington because they don't get as much money for them. They can get out-of-state tuition or they can get full tuition. So what's happening in those states is a basic choice. How do they use their state subsidy? Do they just continue to subsidize the institutions to go serve anybody? Or do they, in fact, purchase back attention to those institutions to serve the states in which they're located? And I think that's increasingly going to be a problem. It's going to be less of an issue for community colleges because their whole bread and butter and their life is really engaged. The other institutions are increasingly tuition-driven, and the issue is what incentives are there to serve Texas students and to get Texas students through to a degree and to a credential which is useful and connected to the future of. So the finance policy becomes one not simply of subsidizing institutions, but actually linking it to serving Texas. That's really the implication. Now, I'd probably be shot for saying that, but I mean, that's the issue. I mean, you can have good institutions, but whether they in fact are connected with serving Texas will be more dependent upon how you fund them than anything else.
Ames, Woody, thank you. I know that we could go on probably all afternoon with a lot more detailed questions, but just briefly, because we've got a couple minutes before our next meeting, David, do you have comments on the agenda for the next meeting? I've got a couple thoughts.
I had thoughts. I think we may need to think where we need to proceed given the outcome of this meeting. I had anticipated that we would address the potential targets related to the workforce, in fact. I think that goes forward neatly from this meeting. There's one of the proposed targets had to do with essentially linking how well the programs in higher education are linked with industry in the state. And then the other two had to do with really outcomes, one meaning related to employment, and the other one related to industry's view of the skills of the graduates. And so I think that continues to follow very well from this meeting, and anticipated that we might want to have, and we hadn't discussed it, someone like Carnevale, who's talked about needs in general and in critical fields in a more national scope than Texas. I do think following this that we may want to see if we can propose some measure internationally directly related to this meeting to the discussion here and have it on at the agenda next time so that you don't lose.
Well, I was going to suggest
context,
that,
you can't, yeah, I think
the
we
first
need to
part
do
of the
that.
next meeting's agenda should address, and it may even involve perhaps an email survey of the members who listened to all of this today, just to see if there's some consensus developing, but to address the some decisions or some recommendations that came from this meeting.
In fact, I wondered if we could find a way to construct even something that would sort of summarize some key elements from the discussion this morning with the Chancellor in terms of some of those recommendations, just at least get some feedback from members of the committee in terms of which of those they think are important in terms of following up on as we go forward. Because there's going to be 3 months before the next meeting, and we need to do something to keep you engaged.
I, for one, would say that if we're talking about a different measurement of skill sets, I mean that sounds like something totally different from what y'all are doing at the coordinating board. I don't know, maybe not, but maybe it would be worthwhile, Woody, for the OECD, but whatever. I've always been bad with acronyms, but maybe that would be something contextually.
Was that
it would
Andreas,
be interesting for the rest of us that have been so. I mean, I'm not doing this every day, but that's a whole new way to measure for me. And it seems if we're wanting our skills, our workforce skills, to match what's going on here, it probably would be interesting to see what the rest of the world's doing.
The report on that I've been describing is going to be released in March, and is likely to. And what it will talk about is the knowledge and skills in the United States as compared with this other, along the way that I'm describing it. And it might be possible to get somebody like Andreas, to come here and meet with you all and discuss that directly.
I think that would make sense. And during the break, Woody asked it to what extent we work with OECD, and we really haven't. And we may need to explore having some closer relationship and be more involved in their activities as we go forward. But I think you're right. And there are some things that we're doing that haven't come up in this context related to what we're doing with transfer, in which we're using a tuning process that was used in Europe with our transfer efforts to connect programs with industry to see if they're really aligned with what industry's looking for. And so there's some things that
you're already doing.
Yeah, that we're already doing that we can perhaps enhance in some ways as we move forward with this kind of discussion. So it may be that you may want to focus much of the entire meeting on just a continuation of this discussion, because there's a lot to do. This is a sort of a major change in direction in some ways that you may want to be much more knowledgeable of before you make a decision about the specific goal.
Fred, two quick thoughts. It occurred to me that particularly when I looked at Woody's chart about the highest achieving countries in the world educationally, it makes sense to me, for example, that for closing the gaps, our goal was to reach parity with the 10 largest states. Why might not our goal for 2030 be to reach parity with the 10 highest performing countries? We're way behind. That would be a huge leap if we got to parity or the average among the 10 best performing countries. Secondly, this question of soft skills, it's not enough to produce degrees and certificates. You need to make sure people have the skills. Well, the reason we've had such trouble with learning outcomes is because we've tried to measure them quantitatively. That's where the stumbling block is. But we can measure them qualitatively because there's reams of data that show what employers want in their workers. We know that they want good problem-solving skills or critical thinking skills. They want communication skills. They want leadership skills. They want the ability to work in teams. why couldn't we simply work with an organization like the Texas Business Leadership Council and simply survey a cohort of large employers every year to find out how they feel about the training that the recent Texas graduates have received and how successful they are at their entry-level jobs. I can't imagine that...
That, in fact, is one of the proposed measures from FSG, which is how do employers view their folks. In fact, the coordinating board did that 20 years ago and quit doing it, quit doing it 20 years ago. I think it's important, related to that, some of you may have seen some issues regarding the core curriculum that the board just adopted the revisions, and the board members certainly remember. And one of the changes to that was that it was built in that those courses needed to contain elements of critical thinking, the ability to communicate and to work well in groups. So, and that actually has met some resistance. We are getting a few letters from faculty who don't seem to understand that. And so part of what we need to do is to do this in a more focused, systematic way. So there are elements here that I think you can hear. There's some of them we're doing, but this is the one Raymond mentioned. I mean, this has been mentioned by industry for 20, 25 years. And I know actually Mr. Messer was on a committee with the technology industry, and we, aside from you, very few people mention real technical shortcomings. They typically mention these other skills. You mentioned some in terms of engineering that I remember well, but those still remain, and so for 20 years we haven't really directly addressed those as it's sort of central to whatever else you do. And so I think that's
which is a shame because it takes 10 to 20 years to see of consistent surveying to see the results.
Well, we said 15 years ago it was consistent, and 10 years.
I know you want to bring this to close. I just one of the things the difficulty is with a survey like that is turning it into action that actually leads to change in behavior. One of my latest examples in Korea, they do a similar survey, the Federation of Korean Employers, and the survey comes up that as the degree production has gone up, the employer's frustration with the inadequacy of graduates has increased. Which is really an interesting feature. The problem, the benefit of a what I call a qualifications framework is that that's not just a survey, it's connecting it with a conversation about the explicit competencies. Okay? So it isn't just, and therefore then you develop an instrument like PIAC which in fact measures that objectively. My experience is that you will do those surveys every year, and by 2020 there will be no change whatsoever. They'll still be frustrated because there is no, it's not turned into action. It's not defined in a concrete way that then can be changed into curriculum and practice. So
we would develop those other components as well. We're aware of that problem.
Yeah, it's well said, because anecdotally, the perfect example that David was alluding to is that my friend Ray here, who's chairman of Walter P. Moore Engineers, no longer hires bachelor's engineering graduates.
Yeah.
A master's is the entry level for most of your new employees. What does that say about the caliber of the competencies within that particular field? So,
work for Ray, get a master's.
That's one thing it says, yeah.
That's right.
So, long way to go. We will close this meeting since we're almost 10 minutes over time, and I appreciate everybody's patience and input. I hope it's been exciting, and
very interesting.
We will maintain the context of all this.